Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for attending this course at CHI 2025 titled How to Write Higher Quality CHI Papers in parentheses with AI research tools. A lot of people that have taken this course have written back to me as in like, oh, I actually was able to write a much better paper afterwards. So this is my goal for you, that you're going to leave this course with the ability to write a CHI paper. Now you're thinking, who's this guy? I was associate chair and subcommittee chair for the Games and Play subcommittee at CHI. I've served for 9 years. I'm kind of semi-retired. Is that something you can do before you turn 50? Probably not. But I am tenured and university chair, so I really have no pressure at home to do anything more in terms of service. And I focus a lot on my business these days. But I still like to serve for CHI, so I still review actively. I've won Best Reviewer Award at CHI Play last year. So I do this quite intensively and quite a lot, and I've written dozens of CHI and HCI reviews over the years. I was the inaugural chair of the CHI Play conference, kind of started that whole series, and was on the steering committee for, I think in total it was 4 years. And did the conference chairing twice, once in Barcelona, where CHI is next year. And I was papers chair, technical problems chair. Anyways, I could talk about this for a long time, but please trust me when I say I know how to do this. What about you? What do you want to take out of this? So we're here for you and hopefully to give you the tools to be more successful. A lot of it is mindset too. You have to understand, like, why are you doing this, right? Like, are you doing it because you want to publish at the most difficult venue? Is it like a personal satisfaction to get in? Is it visibility? Or is it making connections and getting like the most that you can out of CHI for your networking and like possibly meeting some people that can write you tenure reviews and other stuff like that? We'll try to cover a lot of that as well. So what will you learn today? We'll analyze the structure, and oh my, we're going to talk about rhetoric for a hot second. Now, if you have a technical background, rhetoric might be like something that you're not really familiar with, but it's actually super helpful if you're trying to get published and if you're trying to write something that's meaningful, impactful, and changes people's lives, which is kind of like the ultimate goal of what we're trying to do here, right? So we'll talk about that. Structure is really important, but rhetoric is also important, so I'm going to try and cover both of that. This first unit really is very much about writing the CHI paper. It is not so much about AI. We'll dig into AI a little bit later. How to write higher quality CHI papers. Okay, so to write higher quality papers, first of all, we need to write papers. And to write papers, we need to understand what does it actually mean to write papers. So we're going to start at that very bottom. So when we write papers for a conference like CHI, first of all, we have to understand what does CHI actually mean? Like, what is this beast that's CHI? Okay, so CHI is a giant conference. You find it in the small print on the website as well. I think we have about 22 subcommittees now, plus or minus. Just keeps going up. And it currently has 2 short review rounds. So we got about 41% into R&R, about 26% into accept, right? So you can see the attrition over time. And you have now different paper types, right? So this is all confusing for a first-time author, right? Like somebody that's done this a lot of times, like, okay, I know exactly what to do. But now we have kind of like, it's up to you. It used to be 10 years ago, used to be ACM format, ugly AF, and you could just follow that format. You had to write your 10 pages, it was done at the end. And then you had to like actually cut your references because your reference counted against your page limit. Imagine that. But so paper types, we have short, full length, and excessively long. So what's the problem? The problem is the good stuff's in the middle still, right? So full length, about 8,000 words, is still the preferred type of paper, and the paper that gets smoothest in terms of sailing by the reviewers because they actually understand what's going on. So if you're kind of targeting in the 8K to 10K range in terms of word count, that's the kind of paper that will likely get accepted because it doesn't fringe on the formats, right? If you're a little bit more of a skilled author, by all means go for a shorter paper, which is around 5K. This is because we used to have this format called notes at CHI. Notes were sort of the 4-page papers, still a good contribution nugget, actually a little bit harder to get in because I think the acceptance rate was around 12 or 15%, it was really low. But they were really nice, right? Because you had a really condensed version of like a study nugget or a systems paper, and you could fit it into that 5K word limit. CHI is very finicky when it comes to these overly long papers because just imagine the reviewers, right? Like put yourself in the shoes of a reviewer. You're asking me now to put twice the effort into your paper. You better make it worth my time, right? Like always think about the people that you're serving. This is something This is something that is not really in the researcher mindset. If you ever worked in sales, or if you ever done like a customer representative job or a waiting job or something, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? Like you need to talk about the recipient, the other person. A lot of us don't think like that. As academics, we always think about, oh my God, I have done the best research. This is like the coolest thing. I need to get it out there. Kudos to you. That's awesome. But you know what? There's other people involved in this process. So think about them first, which will ultimately make you more successful. So if you write a paper thinking about somebody has to review that thing, and it has to go through that process, and you make it as palatable as possible for that reviewer, you're likely going to be more successful. So the best mindset to adopt to get a paper accepted is to think about the people that are going to review it. If you want to have the smoothest process, think about the 8K to 10K range that you want to land in terms of what you're producing. It is something that is easy enough to review. It's something that the reviewer expects to review. Once you pass 12K, that is something the reviewer doesn't expect. And now at Kai, of course, you also have mandatory videos upon acceptance. This is another thing that has changed recently. Now we have to do these videos as well, so extra work. Teaser figures are really, really good in terms of selling your paper again. Like we even did it with a paper that, like, we didn't really have a teaser figure, but we did have like a nice experimental shot. So this is something you have to think about earlier on as you're doing your experiment. Maybe get somebody to photograph the experiment, do a nice little shot of the setup. Like if you do something like we do extra games and VR and like games in general are great. That's a good teaser figure, gets people like interested in what's going on inside of the paper there. So this is getting more and more important. Not really the standard yet, but I bet you in a couple of years this is just going to be the standard. And another thing that Kai loves to do is they love to focus on design guidelines. A lot of the papers end with like a design guidelines. Now you don't have to do that, but it is really something that can help you stand apart and that people can build upon, because what does it do to your paper? It makes it actionable. And what's still the case is empirical studies is still the biggest category. And yes, I get it. We have a lot of love for design. We have a lot of love for systems papers. But the standard paper, if you want the least friction, is still an empirical paper. I'm sorry, it's still your standard study, which is why we're going to talk about the standard empirical layout of a paper, which is IMRAT in terms of structure, in the session today as well. You can do these other things if you want to, but you can also minimize friction. Minimize friction means easier acceptance, okay? And Kai is also in a wiggly space about contribution types. Now, you might have read the Woodbrock and Keen's paper from back in the day. I think it's like 10 years old now, where they talked about these 7 or 8 contribution types, and Kai kind of adopted that idea. Subcommittees are kind of looking for this stuff in terms of different gravity or different severity. So now on the Kai website, this is what they're identifying. I've kind of condensed them a little bit, but the meaning is still the same. This is the kind of contribution types they're looking for. So either you're doing an interface design and techniques, so you have to ask yourself, guess what I did? I asked Gemini to do like a really nice and concise question about each of these things. And it came up with really good questions. So this is like a good use of AI when you're like, okay, this is actually how I really like using AI. So I'm like, okay, so here's a description of category X. Can you ask me one succinct question that I can answer to fit into that category? And this is what they came up with. And I actually think those are really good questions. So interface design and techniques, does my artifact solve a real problem and give enough detail to replicate, right? Like that's the one question you got to answer if you're submitting as an interface design and techniques. Understanding users, by far the biggest subcommittee, and I think split in 3 subcommittees, and we'll talk about what that means in terms of acceptance rate for your paper as well, is does the study reveal a new user insight and clearly expose my methods and my biases? This is important now. If you ever struggled with something called a positionality statement, or a reviewer asks you to do a positionality statement, so there's 2 takes on this, right? Like there's a lot of reviewers that are a little bit on the warpath when it comes to positionality statements, because what they want to do is they want you to clearly expose your bias, which in theory, that's a good thing, right? Like we want to acknowledge our biases when we're working with data, and we want to kind of see where we're coming from, specifically if you're reporting qualitative data. However, sometimes a positionality statement exposes you as the author in a vulnerable position, in which case it is absolutely not required and shouldn't be required to put in a positionality statement. So absolutely feel free to push back on that if you're in that position, as in like, you're studying a vulnerable group and you're kind of part of that vulnerable group. Let's say something that is not in the popular canon of HCI papers. You can push back on these things, right? So you can actually push back on a positionality statement if the reviewer asks you, you must do that. So understanding users, you want to have new insights and clearly say where your methods are coming from. Systems, tools, and infrastructure, this is kind of the WISTI kind of subcommittee where we're looking at, okay, what are the new capabilities we get from that system, and what's the technical proof? So it's not just enough to present a system at Chi, but you have to do like a half-assed study, right? Like, because a lot of the systems papers have like these tiny studies where it's like, okay, there's no effect size here. It's like you did it with 10 people as a proof of concept, right? But it gets into Chi because it's a WIS paper. It's like and it has a flashy video. I've actually served on the WIS subcommittee. Trust me, those flashy WIS videos go a long way. The video does a lot for your paper. But of course, it has to be sound. It has to be a good system. The system has to really wow you, and you have to kind of really provide a good proof of concept. It has to be good enough. It can't just be like a non-study, essentially. Or you could do a method paper. Those are really hard to get accepted into Chi, right? You're presenting a new methodology, or you're taking a methodology. Those health people in here, there's a big opportunity right now. Health is really rising in the Chi space, right? So you can take some of the RCT studies, which Chi still has an issue with, and you could just be, oh, this is a method of how we implement like a proper RCT protocol in the HCI space or whatever. And you bring that method to Chi and say, okay, this is how it's supposed to be done. Got to be novel, at least for this community, and useful and ready for people to adopt. So you've got to describe it well. Theory, even harder than methodology paper. So if you're kind of sort of more a senior prof here and you're kind of thinking, oh, I need a challenge in my life, try to write a theory paper for Chi. But you got to find something that pushes HCI forward, shows a clear explanation or some predictive value, right? Like you're saying, okay, this is how the field's going to change or something like that. Innovation, creativity, vision is another really difficult one to contribute, right? Like a genuine leap, some benefits, exclusions, risks acknowledged. There are some categories where you can write these papers actually quite well. Some of the newer categories in the Chi space. Still think it's a little bit difficult. Argument, somebody coming from the humanities. This is the kind of paper you would write in the humanities, and we do welcome humanities scholars at Chi. So you can write an argument paper, so you can try to make a provocative claim and support and balance it with counter views, and you just got to find the right review is what I'm saying. And then validation and replication. We had this thing that Max did a couple of years ago where he had like this big Chi workshop about validation and replication and replicae, I think it was called, right? Like, and Chi was all like, oh, replication crisis. If you're doing psychology, you know about the replication crisis. Chi has it too. Chi just doesn't acknowledge it as a crisis. This is just how we do work. We don't replicate things. But it is actually a problem, right? Like we want to do more validation and replication, but it is really hard to argue for that. So making a good argument for your paper that it's a replication paper, but also presenting something novel is something that really requires some skill. So you should definitely consider it, but it is really, really tricky. All right, some data. This is kind of the accept, reject data from all the different subcommittees at Chi. And as you can see here, there's definitely differences, right? UX, as usual. Even in the time when I was still serving as associate chair and subcommittee chair, UX was always the tough one. And you'd think like a conference like Chi, you want to write UX papers for, don't submit to the UX subcommittee. So UX subcommittee is like the tough cookie. Super, super hard to get in, lots of rejects. Sure, there's other ones. I mean, one of the things, of course, you can also see like in terms of submissions, right? Like health gets a lot of submissions these days, so a lot more popularity. Design is still the biggest one in terms of submissions, gets 378 submissions, and accessibility and aging accepted the most papers. That's quite interesting. This is an interesting thing about accessibility in general. Like there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of appetite, let's say, in the Chi community for accessibility, which seems natural, right? Like we want to make things more accessible. Ben Schneiderman had this huge argument for universal design, which is at its heart accessibility for everyone, right? And so there is a trend towards that, and that is definitely something that could be seen as, okay, maybe there's just by default, if we want to acknowledge our biases, maybe more of a bias towards a paper that's in that space because you're doing something for the human good. You're making something more accessible. Okay, well, maybe this is different than writing a games paper. By the way, games is the second to lowest in terms of rejections. Specific application areas had the highest acceptance rate. If you're just looking at the rate, the highest papers were in accessibility, but in terms of rate, in terms of percentages, specific application areas was out there. And then understanding people, just because it's so large and it was split into 1, 2, 3 subcommittees, specifically the mixed and alternative methods is the hardest to get into. Guess why? Because a lot of people just don't understand how mixed methods work. And specifically, if you're providing something like a new method or something, you have to do so much more legwork to explain to the reviewers how that actually works. Whereas if it's a qualitative or quantitative, that's like the warm, comfy oatmeal of a paper right there, right? Like it feels good, I know what it is, I'm going to eat that. So that's one of the things of why you can play it safe or not so safe, depending on the subcommittee. So one of the things that people always ask me, like, does the subcommittee matter? 100% the subcommittee matters, right? Like the subcommittee choice is almost as important as the choice of like what research question am I going to pick for my paper, right? So it's a really, really important thing to think about before submission. You want to be strategic about this. Because again, this is the whole process that we're going through at CHI these days. We have the authors submitting the papers, then we have the papers chairs doing the check, subcommittee chairs doing the check, associate. So there's 3 checks. At each level, you can get desk rejected, right? Like at each of these, if your paper doesn't fit the mold, you're gonna already get desk rejected. Then the reviewers get invited. Then the review happens. Then we have that initial discussion, at which stage some ACs, associate chairs, which is the chairs for the specific within the specific subcommittee areas, can already say this is not good enough, or I'm going to recruit an extra reviewer that will help me make that argument for that. And then you get the meta review. And then, only then, do we get that first round of reviews where we can actually reply, push back, rebut, and revise our paper and write a better paper. Thing is, you can actually use AI a little bit with some information that you can feed it to do a little bit of that for you, right? Like you can prompt AI to be like, okay, so here's some data about subcommittee X. What would somebody in that subcommittee possibly try to criticize about me? It's not super accurate, but the high-end models like Gemini 2.5 Pro actually like produce some initial things to work off of in terms of criticism. That's a good use of AI. Criticize your paper before you submit it. Don't get ChatGPT to write the entire paper, okay? That's not a good use of AI. Then it all goes through second review, discussion, decision meetings, what to accept, and then final decisions. And as you can see here, there's still quite a bit of drop-off between round 1 rejects and round 2 rejects. Of course, we could also look at the ones that are like UX and learning actually seem to have an even health, seem to have quite a bit of rejects after the first round of submission. So maybe a little bit more positive at the beginning and maybe more rejects later. So this is like a whole process going through this CHI cycle of revise and resubmit and rejects and all of that stuff. So why even bother in the first place? And are there any universal truth or things that we can use that help us understand academic writing? Who here did academic writing before going to CHI? Who's new to CHI and coming like from a cross discipline that has like who here has published as something that wasn't CHI before coming to CHI? You might have actually had a similar experience there, that a good paper has these core tenets, the core elements that I call them, that all need to be covered to actually make it useful. So first of all, needs to be clear and precise, right? So this is something that if you're a new student and you're here because you're like young and entering this field right now, clarity and precision is probably the hardest thing at the beginning for you. This is with my students as well. It's like we're really good at writing down the methods section because we had to submit that to get ethical approval, usually in North America anyways. Europe's a little bit lax on the ethics. We had to then find a way to actually report that step by step what we've done. It is much harder to think about, okay, so but what do I put in the introduction now? What do I put in the discussion? A lot of you have written, like, discussion is really hard for me, right? So clarity and precision really go a long way. And yes, you can prompt an AI to make things clear and more precise and more concise as well. Those are good keywords to think about when you're actually prompting the AI to help you with your writing. Clarity and concision, really, and precision, really important. Evidence-based, right? So, and again, you see this kind of flow chart going from complex idea, precise language, clear structure, and that makes it accessible to understand. And then evidence-based. Of course, any sort of academic writing, and this is how it's different from any sort of other writing, needs to present evidence, right? This is where the AI tools really rock the boat right now, right? Because what is evidence in academic writing? How do you present evidence? User studies evidence. You collected data. You present data. That's the biggest piece of evidence you can put in a paper. The core of the paper is actually evidence. Okay. Other parts of the paper, how do you present evidence there? AI is actually really good, or the tools that they've built now, they're all based, by the way, on Semantic Scholars API, so there's a little bit of the bias. I'm looking forward to the moment when Google turns on the Scholar AI into Gemini. Then things are really going to change, because like who here isn't using Google Scholar to find their references? Probably most people are using a mix between Google Scholar and Scopus, like maybe Web of Science, something like that, right? To find your references. So just imagine that switching on. Right now, a lot of the tools, the ones that we're presenting here today, like Scholar C, like Jenny AI, like Yomu AI and some of these, they all feed into the Semantic Scholar API, right? So they pull from Semantic Scholar. What is Semantic Scholar? It's essentially an indexing database, kind of something like Google Scholar, right? They crawl the web and they index the papers. And what's the difference? It's semantic search versus index keyword search. So for systematic review, what's the important thing? We got to find out a keyword list, right? We got to have that Boolean logic that we can say and, or, and the different keywords, right? Semantic search doesn't work that way, right? Semantic search is just like the semantics, like understanding the natural language of the thing that I put in. So instead of having to put keywords, I can actually like ask a question, just like a Google search works, right? So I ask a question and it infers from that thing what I actually meant. So that's semantic search, that's the difference. And that's kind of where we're moving towards with all the AI search engines, is that we do a semantic query instead of a keyword-based query. Can you imagine what the downside of that is, potentially? Precision, right? Like anything that does an inference, anything, this is also the thing with LLMs, right? Like LLMs are great, but they're also kind of fuzzy and muddy and you kind of really don't know what's going on. This is like this big super stuff. It's ramen again. Precision is really, really important because in precision, like if you have a specific keyword, you know exactly that that keyword's going to be found. But what does that keyword require? It requires you to do really good indexing in the first place of your paper. So the benefit, of course, of semantic searches is just searches the entire PDF. It just searches the entire knowledge base instead of having to search just the one single thing. We want to be in a structured format, and we're going to talk about that format here as well, which is abstract, introduction, related literature, methodology, results, discussion, conclusion, references, right? Like that's your standard empirical Chi paper. This is kind of the standard mold that you fit into, and you've all written these types of papers, and we'll go over that. Formal tone and style, this is another thing. When the AI tools first came out, there was this tool called Quillbot. Quillbot could academize your language. It actually did the opposite of what I do for a living, because like I edit papers, of course. I try to get the academic language out of the paper, whereas these AI tools were trying to put it into the paper. So like passive voice and like long sentences. This is kind of what the world thinks academic writing should look like. Is not what I think academic writing should look like, right? Like I think active voice, first person, narrative kind of style, like that's my jam. That's how I write. Like I want to write something that's lively, not something that's like stuck up and hard to read. And unfortunately, there's still some profs, maybe in this room, that are absolutely on that train and that think, no, you gotta write it dry. No, you actually don't. I'm sorry, I have to disagree with you. You don't have to write a dry paper for it to be a good paper. A paper has to be actually interesting. And you can do that with writing, and you can still be formal in your language, but you can be formal and active at the same point in time. So formal tone and style is important, but it doesn't mean to be stilted, hard to read, and just like very difficult in terms of parsing the information. You want that information to be out there. Format of a paper. So essentially, all of the papers kind of follow this same format idea. They follow the specific structure that is required by your contribution type. Again, we're looking at empirical here as our main thing when we go through this structure, but even if you're looking at other contributions, even if you're writing a systems paper, it'll differ, and I'll show you in a sec too. You always want to have the clear headings and subheadings so that you can guide the reader through it. You always want to have a logical flow. And this is really, if you're a new student, this is one of the tricky bits. What does logical flow mean? It means thinking about transitions, right? Like a lot of the times you have idea A, you have idea B, idea C, and this is where rhetoric comes in. You kind of want to connect idea A to idea B to idea C. You can do that with transition sentences. You can do that with thinking about the structure. And then you want to get a logical flow going between the sections and have these really smooth transitions. So what is most crucial for a Chi paper then? Well, it's actually on the Chi website, as you might know. These are the actual official, actually it's not on the website, it's on a Precision conference once you log in as a reviewer. These are the criteria that reviewers are presented with when they read your paper. So again, if you're writing a paper, you gotta write it through the reviewer's eyes. Don't only think about your paper as in you need to tell your story. That's important too. But when you're done with your paper, you gotta reflect on your paper in terms of these criteria. And can you do a check mark between each of these? Like originality. Is it original, right? Like it's not super important. And I think they switched the order now. Significance is like number 1, originality is number 2. But it needs to be somewhat original, which is again, replication crisis, right? Like if you're just replicating word, by default, it's not original. But it should still have a space in science. But originality is a criterion for the reviews at Chi. Significance, right? Like important opportunities. What does importance mean? The introduction's job is really to establish that importance, and we'll talk about that as well. But importance is really at the heart of this thing. And then, of course, research quality. A lot of people, they always say research quality is the most important. And yeah, that's true to a degree, but sometimes people will make a trade-off. If it's really significant work, and the research quality wasn't so great, then they might give some feedback, and they might hope that in the second round of reviews, research quality should always be the primarily important thing. What is research quality? It means like documenting everything properly, like having done the right approach, doing what you said you were doing, being transparent about your methods. If you're doing quantitative work, doing the right kind of statistics, if you're doing statistics, like doing something like a power analysis these days, like we used to not do power analysis at Chi, right? Like, I'm sorry, every statistician will tell you that's nonsense, right? Like, you gotta do a power analysis too, and you gotta actually report effect sizes as well, if you're doing quant anyways. If you're doing qualitative, right? Are you doing something other than Brown and Clark's thematic analysis? And if you're doing it, do themes emerge? Some people get really finicky on that. And Brown and Clark, if you've ever done qualitative research, are also like very strict on that language, right? Like, if you wrote themes emerge, you're already on the no-no list. Handling of prior work. Again, have you found the right word? And this is actually where it gets tricky, specifically with AI. If you're only using AI, and if you're only using the tools that are present here, you will not have done a thorough handling of prior work. Because a lot of the times, the databases that the tools use are limited. Again, I told you, a lot of them are just using the Semantic Scholar API. So that means they miss a lot of research that's out there that you can find on Scopus, on Google Scholar, that's not publicly available. Also, they will, of course, mix in preprints, right? Archives are really big on the preprints. A lot of preprints get mixed in. And as you know, preprints are not peer-reviewed papers. Handling of prior work is really important. Presentation, again, you want to have logical flow, you want to have good organization. Presentation is really, really important as well. So you want to cover all of these. And the most important thing is legitimate, distinctive, clear-cut, and unique contribution to HCI. This is what kind of makes or breaks the paper. If you cannot articulate that, and usually happens, if you look at the proceedings, it usually happens at the very end of the papers these days. It's like, okay, this is how we're going to make that contribution. And you want to really say this has moved the field forward, there's valid contributions here, and it tells us something about how we should think or act differently. If you cannot answer that question after the end of your paper, how can we think and act differently? So you really want to be able to answer that question at the end of it if you want to be able to leave a lasting impression with the paper. But where do you start? You always get there with a research question, right? Like, what do you want to find out to make better evidence-based decisions? If you're new to science, if you're new to research, this might not be something that you're super interested in or super aware of at the beginning. This is the research question, and this is the proper method to investigate that research question. Good science, good research always starts with something that you want to find out. Here's something I want to find out. Here's an interesting question that I want to answer. Now let's pick the methods and everything else after we've settled on that question. So find out the interesting question in the field first, then pick the methods. Always start with the research question. It's got to be clear, it's got to be specific, what do you want to accomplish, it's got to be focused, realistic, and measurable, right? So this is, you could also feed these criteria to, I think I have a GPT. If you want that, hit me up via email. I have a GPT somewhere that actually criticizes your question, whether or not it's a good research question based on these criteria, because I just fed that in the instructions to the thing. This is essentially how we get to the problem. Because we, ideally at the beginning of our research, we want to have a topic statement. This is kind of something that lets us hinge everything else off the paper around this topic statement. So it actually helps us discover our problems. It's a good thing to guide the rest of the paper around. So this is sort of how you go into this research idea if you just use that format. So write down, this paper introduces, and then think about in your recent work, or it can be something that you're thinking about. You're basically saying this paper introduces, and then you think about, okay, so what do I want to introduce? What's the kind of system that I want to introduce? But maybe you want to start with this thing to kind of think about what's the problem that I'm actually addressing here. So it might be good to start in the middle and think about, okay, so what's my problem? Because this is my solution, this is my problem, and which improves upon existing solutions by how do you think you set yourself apart from the best current knowledge that you have of the literature? Right? Like, I'm expecting everyone kind of knows the literature in their field a little bit. Now, of course, if you did this properly at home, you do a little bit of a lit review search, you do a little bit of finding out what else is out there. But from your current state of knowledge, where you're at right now, how do you think it improves upon existing solutions? Let's go over the 3 C's. The 3 C's are essentially what every paper is about. So ideally, you want to cover all of these in different parts of your paper. and you want to make them as great as possible, and each of these questions will help you do that. So first, you want to identify the context. This is really important when we're making an argument. This is actually really important when you're using an LLM as well, because if you don't give an LLM enough context, the output of the prompt will actually be bad, right? In a similar way, if you don't provide enough context in your paper, the reading of the paper will be hampered and it will not be as good, and you will not be able to make as much sense of it. Ideally, your paper needs to provide enough context for the problem. What is the problem? Why is it significant for HCI? Whom does it affect? How are the current solutions limited? And what previous work has been done? And guess what? A lot of that context stuff is actually done right at the beginning, right? The introduction is sort of the biggest job of the introduction is to really lay down the context. And I would say a solid half part, or maybe at least a third part of the introduction, should be focused just around that context, just establishing that context for everyone. Then you have your content. Content is really the middle part of the paper. But it also, just because, and we'll talk about that hourglass structure in a sec as well, just because the way that papers are structured like an hourglass, you also want to reprise the content in your introduction. So you're going to foreshadow what you're going to do. You're going to have it in your abstract as well. You're going to talk about what you actually did. And of course, it's in detail in the middle of your paper, in your method and your results section, because that's essentially what you did. What's your solution? How does it solve the problem? What are the key elements? What methods did you use? And how is your approach different? And the interesting thing is, this works for systems papers too, because even if you don't do an empirical study, the gist, the big part in the middle, would still be the solution. Now, in empirical papers, the solution is a study. In system papers, the solution is the system and the actual description of the system architecture, right? So it would still fit into that. Well, how is that the solution? And in the system, you would describe the key elements. In the study, you would describe the key elements of the study. And what methods did you use is, of course, the methods for the study. But if you're building a system, of course, like what approaches did you use? What APIs, what architectures did you incorporate? How does that system build upon existing things? And how is it different from the things that we know? And then, of course, the biggest thing, the most important thing, usually the last thing in the introduction, in the abstract, and at the end of the discussion section, is the contribution. The contribution is all about your impact, right? Like, what are the specific measurable improvements of your solution? So you're improving something with your solution, but it needs to be specific and it needs to be measurable. If it's not measurable, you're kind of in a fuzzy territory. And yes, sure, I said you can write an argument paper, but guess what? Even if you're writing an argument paper, how does an argument paper provide something measurable for us? Because HCI is so big, and as a field, just in general, and Kai as a conference, a lot of the times we come from our subcommittee, and like I come from the games area, and it's just like, oh, this is a great contribution for games. But is it an HCI contribution, right? And sometimes you're gonna have to think about that. Let's say your background is health, you show up, you do this thing, you're like, oh, this is a great contribution. In health, everyone would just throw up their bellies for that. In HCI might not be the case, right? So you always have to think about the framing. Framing is super important for your paper. Like, you have to think about how you want to frame something, right? And here, this framing has to relate to HCI. It has to relate how the HCI community understands this within their existing methods and paradigms. What new opportunities come from your solution? So you always have to think about that. This kind of relates already to future work in your discussion. And what limitations did you or didn't you overcome? So you always have to think about those as well. And so opportunities and future work kind of go hand in hand, like I said, and that really rounds off a better understanding of how the paper is coming together. IMRAD, what does IMRAD stand for? The weird acronym stands for Introduction, Methods, Results, and Discussion. Essentially, we are a little bit different in HCI because we don't actually have an introduction that also does related work. In psychology, we often do related work as part of the introduction. So we kind of wheel it in, we don't put it in a separate section. But in HCI, there is usually a separate section. Does that mean I cannot cite any related work in my introduction? No, absolutely not. You still have to cite related work in your introduction, but the introduction has a very semantic way of moving through it. The idea is essentially the introduction is more the motivational part. Now in HCI is motivation, so context, but it's also like foreshadowing, this is what we're going to do, as well as contribution at the very end. So that's kind of the job of the introduction. And then the related work is that, hold on, let me just like explain in detail like what of all, how do I situate all of that in the existing literature? So you kind of get this extra section that helps you situate it, even though you've pre-situated it in the introduction, but you're pointing to, I'm going to situate this more in the related work. So what's the job of the related work? It's essentially to set the stage, to say what's known and what's unknown, and how does our work fit into that space of what's known and what's unknown? How does it improve upon that? Introduction is really more like, why did we do it in the first place? Methods is all about like how did we do it? And we need to be clear and transparent, like what did we actually do? Results is, what did we find? What results did we get? Discussion is, what does it mean? And I think that's kind of why it's so hard for a lot of people to write the discussion. Discussion is a little bit of an unsafe space because you have to lean yourself out of the window a little bit. Not too much, because you don't want to make grandiose claims because then your paper gets rejected, but you do have to make some inferences. You do have to provide meaning for your results. And boy, I tell you, PhD students are afraid of that. Master students too, any grad student really. They're afraid of that because we've all been burned by a reviewer too that has said, overclaiming, right? So there is a sweet spot between overclaiming and making meaning out of your results. And you got to find that sweet spot. And that's why discussions are so hard, because you have to find that thing where you still say, okay, this is what that means. And this is how I can reasonably say that that's what that means based on the literature. And again, this is why in the discussion, yes, you have to relate back to the literature. You have to situate the work again. Yes, you have to cite the work again. And this is really how they solve the problem. This is how I've now addressed the problem. And then conclusion, big thing about conclusion. Conclusion is not a summary, okay? Conclusion is the takeaway. What does it mean for us going forward? So don't make that mistake of just, I'm just going to summarize everything. ChatGPT, summarize my paper in a paragraph. Here's my conclusion. That's not a conclusion. That's a summary, okay? So you can, if you want, attempt to summarize everything in one sentence of your conclusion, but the conclusion is really the oompa, the big picture, the boing, the thing that I want to read and I want to leave a lasting impression. It's got to make a sound to me, right? It's got to have some rhythm. It's got to really like ruffle my feathers. If it's something that just leaves the bland aftertaste and I've just finished this paper and I will never remember it, that's bad, right? Like that's not what we want. Ideally, we want something in that last paragraph to really make us reflect on what we've just done, to give us that takeaway, to think about what that means. And sometimes that's hard, because sometimes you just did an incremental study. Welcome to 50% of Chi papers. A lot of our studies are very incremental, so it's really hard to not overclaim, but also make a little bit of an impact in that last sentence. So it's a skill, takes a little bit of training, but do not put it as a summary, but think about what does it mean going forward? What's the takeaway here? The job of the introduction section is to make a compelling case for your research, right? You want to explain why this work is necessary, why it's important, and that means at the beginning you want to describe a problem. There's got to be an inciting incident. A lot of the movies have that, but a good paper has that as well. You have a problem or a situation that's motivating the research, that gives you an undeniable reason for doing this. And ideally, you want to then discuss the current state of the research. That's often a little bit separate, like I said, from what you do in the related work later. You want to give a little bit of a teaser of why this is important. So think no more than 5 or 6, maybe maximum of 7 references that can finagle their way into the introduction. The rest is reserved for the related work and then maybe later in the discussion where you revisit them, but just the important bits and pieces. So do not do something that I see very much too often, which is what I call a citation bomb, where somebody is just like, VR is a motivating factor for sleep deprivation, XYZ, whatever, and it has like 50 citations behind that, right? So first of all, you have a very general statement, and then now you're citing 50 papers to back up that statement. That is a silly way to use citations. Do not do this. People do this way too often. You've definitely read papers like that, and I'm sure right now at Chi, people are presenting papers like that. Do not be part of that group, right? When you cite a paper, when you have a reference, ideally, the semantics of that sentence should relate to the thing that you're citing, right? So do not cite more than 1 to maximum 3 references in a sentence. Otherwise, it is like shooting a cannonball of whipped cream on a strawberry, to use a Japanese reference here. But it's too much, right? Like it will take away from the flavor of that strawberry. So ideally what you want to do here is you want to give enough justification and you want to keep the references in that introduction sparse, and you want to clearly identify the gap, the problem, or the opportunity that is there in the existing knowledge, right? Always start with a problem, then maybe identify a gap. Gap and problem are usually related, and then look at that opportunity that it presents for your own research to come across. And that means you're positioning your work as a possible solution. If your work cannot make an argument for being a possible solution to the problem, then it's not motivating your work. And that way, the introduction has failed to do its service. So the service of the introduction is to do exactly that, provide that inciting incident, maybe at the very end, using the 3 C's, also talk about that specific contribution that you're making. So really, like, find the 3 or 4 most important ones. And yes, I totally have colleagues that fight me back on that, said, no, like, I need to include all of these 5. No, you really don't. Just write an extra sentence if you need to include them. Like, write that extra sentence and contextualize that work that way. Because otherwise, like, it's usually a very general statement, and then now I'm left fishing. And because we're in HCI and not in psychology, where we actually have page references, and it's a little bit easier to actually find the backup for the claim, you're just tossing things out there in an argumentative grandeur moment that you're just trying to say, no, but I'm right, right? Like, and I think it's actually rooted in insecurity of a lot of people, that they think I'm making a statement, I really want to make sure the reviewer gets it, so let me just toss in the 10 references that say I'm actually really, really right here. But what you're actually doing is you're annoying a lot of reviewers, because they're thinking like why? What are you doing, right? It's much more nuanced, to use an AI word. It's much more nuanced if you actually can pinpoint, another AI word, to the different parts of the paper that matter. As in, like, here are 3 arguments from 3 different papers. Let's talk about all the arguments, instead of saying, these are 10 papers about the larger field. Okay. So what do I do with that, right? Like, it's not as useful. Again, always think about your reader first. Like, how can you be of service to your reader? That's your job. You got to serve your reader. You don't serve yourself. This is not a display of your own power here. It is to make it easy for the reader to understand the argument that you're presenting. And that's your job in the introduction. That's what you got to do. Talking about the reader, John Swales, linguist, came up with this wonderful model called CARS, vroom, 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 vroom. But it's not actually those cars, not the vroom cars. It's actually just an acronym for creating a research space. Now, this model has been extremely popular in other fields, but of course, you can also find it in HCI. And anyone that ever dabbled in rhetoric has come across this. This is just 3 moves. A move is actually a rhetoric argument, you could say, a way to persuade the reader in that case. So a rhetoric move is nothing other than a way to present an argument. So these rhetorical moves here are 3 ways to present an argument for your paper, and they're really, really thorough to establish the research space, which is essentially the job of your introduction, is to establish the research space. IMRAD is the structure, CARS is the rhetoric. It's the way that you present within that structure. So CARS is here to establish a territory, and you'll find that later when we look at that hourglass structure again. Establishing a territory is all about saying, this is the space that we're in. You got to pick up people somewhere. You can't just be like, come up with some jargon, or you're like, the non-sequitorial paradigm of the emblematic structure of ephemeral interfaces is a significantly understudied area of water HCI research or something like that. Huh? Right? Like, I might be doing HCI research, but I certainly don't do water HCI research, and I certainly don't understand your jargon, right? So you're not picking up the reader where they're at. So the beginning is like a bus stop. You got to pick up the reader at a bus stop that they're familiar with, which is HCI. So usually that first statement, that broad establishing the territory, is, okay, you're in HCI, so let's talk about my sub-area of HCI, okay? With your HCI knowledge, let's talk about personal computing. Let's talk about health informatics. Let's talk about this thing or that thing. So you want to start broad. You want to introduce the general area, and then you want to claim its importance. So it's not just about the general area, but also saying why this is important. Here's an example. So text entry, for example, that's a subfield in HCI. Text entry is a fundamental task in mobile computing. What does that tell me? that sentence already. It tells me that you're going to talk to me about text entry, and you're telling me that text entry is a subfield of mobile computing. Great. Now I've already made the connection. You're handing me down in the tree, if you think of it as a hierarchical structure. Critical for user communication and productivity. What does that second part of the sentence do? It tells me how all of that matters, even in the broadest of sense. Even my grandma understands productivity, right? Like, that's a word that everyone gets. And user communication in HCI, most people will actually understand what is meant by user communication, okay? So what we're doing here is specific, but this is how the specific matters in the larger context. Sentence 1, that's the job of sentence 1, is telling us exactly what you're about to present to us, and you really want to wiggle us down, funnel us down. Marketers love the term funnel. So this is kind of like a funnel. It funnels you into the paper, so establishing that territory. Then identifying the niche. So here you really want to focus in, you want to find a gap, a problem, or a question in the existing knowledge or the prior work, often known as the research gap. However, you might have seen my post. I wrote a post called Research Gaps Are Bullshit, where I essentially argue for why gaps actually don't matter. And there's a lot of linguists that actually talk about this as well. Because research gaps are nice, and a lot of people will teach junior students, all you got to do is identify a research gap, and that's fine and good. A research gap is a nice first way to start, but as you might understand, a gap is just the absence of knowledge. Here's the thing about knowledge. How do we understand knowledge? What do you think is knowledge? Wild takes here, anyone? After lunch is a great question. Knowledge. So knowledge, the thing about knowledge is it finite or is it infinite? There's always something else to discover. This is just like a fundamental understanding. So once you have that mindset, like, everything gets easier. Once you understand that knowledge is infinite, you can always find out more about something. Like, there's always more to find out. Then what good is it to fix the gaps? Because there will always be another gap. So think about that, right? So you'll always be able to find a gap, because there's infinite gaps out there. So how good is it if you find a gap? It's not so great. Like, it's good because, like, everyone can do it, and I think that's why a lot of supervisors recommend finding a gap, because everyone can find a gap, because there is lots of gaps. But the more important thing is, how does that gap relate to a problem? So kudos to you if you found a gap, but you're not done yet. You still got to go from that gap to the larger overarching problem. What problem does this gap present for HCI? And that's your job here in identifying the niche. You got to find the gap, but you got to relate it to that problem. So what often happens is a sentence like that, where it's like, however, little work, this is my favorite. However, there's a lack of knowledge, or little work has been done on X. Little work has explored text entry for users with visual impairments. Guess why? Because text entry for users with visual impairments is a very, very specific area. The more specific you are in your research question, the easier it is to identify a gap, because, of course, not a lot of people have explored that. So little work has been done in that very specific area, leaving a significant gap. I see what you did there, leaving a significant gap for research. So yeah, you can absolutely do that. But then usually what should come in the sentence after this is, why is that a significant gap? Like, why should we care? Like, take us one step further. Don't just establish the gap, but take us one step further. And this is how we move from identifying the niche to actually occupying the niche, where we're saying not only is there a gap, but the gap matters because this is part of a larger problem. And this is how we're actually attempting to not just fill the gap, but deal with the larger problem here. So presenting specific research questions or a specific approach, and sometimes like even linking it to your main findings or your overview of your approach. So then you're saying, in this paper, we introduce haptic feedback keyboard for visually impaired users. It vibrates when you type on it. Evaluated in a usability study, found it significantly improves typing speed. So here's a potential solution for this particular space that helps us make this problem matter. So the space is a whole different question. So the amount of time, yes, you spend most of your time writing the introduction and discussion sections. Everything else is secondary. Actually, I'd say introduction section, actually abstract and introduction section, you spend the majority of your time in. This is like game development. A lot of people don't know this, but in game development, you spend most of the time developing the tutorial in the first level, because most people don't actually play games more than the first 2 hours. The first hour of play is the most important hour for people. So game companies spend the most time developing that stuff, because the later parts are seen by very, very few people. And the same with the paper. A lot of people don't make it past the introduction and the abstract, so you want to spend a lot of time making that perfect, so that then, you know, the people that are actually interested will funnel again its way all the way through the rest of the paper. So how much time or how much space should you spend? Now that we're doing word limits and not like sections, back in the old ACM format, it was pretty much the first page was like the introduction. So it was in that double column format, it was pretty much on page 2 your related work should start, and then the related work was basically 2 columns or like a half a page. And then after the first 2 pages, you had to go into the method section. So you basically had 2 pages in that 2-column ACM format, which is the first page was your introduction, and then the second page, or the end of, so because the introduction, depending on how many authors you have, it would go until the end of that first column on the second page, and that was the absolute cutoff line for your introduction. And then related work would start, and you had like 2 or 3 columns for the related work, and then by the time you hit page 3, you're going into methods and the study design and so forth. So that's the amount of time you should spend. Don't spend too much time in your introduction. Introduction is all about, like, it's actually where you can delete most of the stuff because it's all about the rhetoric. Introduction is just convincing, persuading people. Don't get lost in dabbling about related work and writing too much about what X and Y has done. You could still do that in the related work section, but even then you have to be concise, right? Like the job of the introduction is to convince the reader to read the paper and that paper matters and why that paper is important, and also the reviewer why they should accept that paper, why this is hitting all the criteria that I said earlier. And so at the end of the introduction, you really want to occupy that niche and saying, like, this is why my paper is the perfect solution for this thing. And then we hop into methods, right? Methods is the easiest to write. Most people don't really have an issue with writing the method section. It's usually what you write the first. I have like a little thing here with in terms of asking yourself like questions that you can answer. But it's really just all the details to a level that somebody else can replicate it. Population, sample, design, procedures. And if you're doing a systems paper, it's of course the exact system architecture to a way that somebody else could implement your system, right? So you have to be very detailed how you would write down that system architecture. And then if it's an empirical paper, it's usually done in past tense. This is a thing that I had a very specific student when she was doing her PhD. She would always write the method section first, but she would write it in a way that she would actually just copy the ethics application. Now, I don't know if you've ever written an ethics application, but ethics application is present tense, right? Like, actually, it's future tense usually, because it's like, we will do this thing. So because you copied it, this thing didn't work, because you have to change it because it has happened. The study has happened by the time you report it in the paper. So I, like the first 3 papers, I spent my time explaining to her that she really has to adjust the tenses here, because it cannot be in future tense, it has to be in past tense, because when you're writing the paper, this is not something that will occur in the future, it's something that has occurred. The experiment has been done, right? So it is past tense. You're talking about something that has already been done. So this is something to keep in mind when you're writing that. And then, of course, active voice as usual. Then the results or the findings, if you're in the qualitative field, then findings is usually your preferred title. But it's all about objectively presenting the findings of the study. Now, we had an SV here from psychology who's gone now. But if you are in psychology, it's much, much stricter even. So in psychology, you actually can get desk rejected if you muddle any interpretations in your results section, right? Results is literally just the result. Here is the analysis of the thing. This is significant. Here are my things. Here's the thematic analysis. Here are the outcomes. In qualitative, it's a little bit harder, right? Because you really just have to present the themes or whatever you did. Or if it's like a different narrative study or something like that. But you really just want to present the results and then save the interpretation, the meaning making for the discussion section. So really, that's when you actually tie it all together. But this is really just bare bones, no commentary, no interpretation. You're just presenting what was done, just the facts and just a very clear reporting of that. So it's actually quite easy to write. Results, I would say, is even easier than methods, right? Because it's literally just like you did the thing in your tool and these are the outcomes and you're just writing it down. So these 2 sections, methods and results, are usually the ones that are done first and easiest, and students usually have the least issues with those. And then we come to the hardest nut to crack, which is the discussion section. So discussion section, first and foremost, is the section where you have to do the so what question. This is the most important thing that your discussion section has to answer. So what? You have to, like every paragraph that you read in your discussion section, you should ask yourself, so what? So what does it all mean, right? Like this is the most important thing to answer here. So ideally you do that in a 3-way structure here. The first one should be just, again, the background information. Here, despite what I said about conclusion is not okay, but at the beginning of the discussion, it's actually okay to provide a brief summary. Why is that the case? Because some people actually skip ahead. Some people will not have the patience to read your methods and your results. I know, I'm sorry, I hate to break it to you, but some people just skip those sections. And so they just hop right into, from introduction, hop right into the discussion. And so those people, just because of the way they read their paper, they would like just a quick restate of everything. The people that have actually made its way through their paper, that have read this linearly, they will probably have forgotten your research question by the time they hit your discussion. I don't know if you've ever put an 8,000 to 10,000 word paper into one of those reading apps, the AI apps that turn it into like a reading thing. But if you read that at regular speed, how long do you think does it take to read an 8,000 word paper? It's usually like an hour and a half to 2 hours is what it takes to like read the stuff. Discussion section at the beginning, you want to restate the aim, the questions, the hypothesis. You want to, again, remind us of the key published research. Yes, it's okay to point to the related work section again. And you want to remind us about your methodology. It's not super important, but like if you're doing an empirical paper, just having a sentence in there is not too bad. Then you want to present a statement of results. Okay, statement of results means, again, remind us from the entire results sections, what are the most important things to take out of there, right? Like find a maximum of 3. If you have 8 results, I'm sorry, you have too many. Kai actually doesn't like super complicated papers. There is something about like one research question, one answer. Like sure, you get the 3 research questions or whatever papers at Kai, but like the ones that are most streamlined are really like directed. It's like you one thing, like one takeaway, whatever, right? And so oftentimes in Kai, it's like, okay, sure, you have 1 or 2 or maximum 3 studies, right? And then you have 1 or 2 or maximum 3 results that you talk about. Sure, you can have 5 or 6, but it gets really fuzzy once you like at 8 results or whatever. Like it's really hard to present this in a way, and it takes a lot of skill to do that. So save yourself the trouble, have a maximum of 1 to 3 findings that you restate in the discussion and that you interpret here. And now here's the trick, right? Like you can have these, and then you can still come up with 8 design guidelines. Because usually, if I think back about my papers, we usually have like 6 to 8 design guidelines because it just looks good. Looks like you've done a lot at the end. And yeah, so restate the key results, and then we get to the important part, which is now you got to evaluate and comment on your findings, right? So this is just the fluff. This is sort of the bun on the hamburger. Now we get to the meat. And so here you want to explain the results. The job is to suggest reasons for why these results are there. This is the hard part, right? Like I said, it's hard for PhD students because you've got to lean yourself out of the window a little bit. So connect it back to your research question. And when I say suggest reasons, it actually means suggest reasons. There's no guaranteed formula. It's just this thing here, the old mind that has to do something. Like you actually have to like come up with something. I'm sorry, this is like actually really super creative, this part. You have to kind of think about what does it mean? And that means, sometimes it means sitting down an entire afternoon and just thinking about what does it mean? Having discussions with lab mates, having discussions with your supervisor if they're available, and having discussions with somebody that actually cares about this research. And that will get you thinking about this and suggesting some reasons. And then ideally tying it back to the literature. So this is a difficult part, but here's the thing that makes it a little bit easier because yeah, once you've done that, hardest part, you get to unexpected or expected results. So this is actually easy because ideally you've done a lot of work with the related literature, so it should be easy to say whether or not this is something that you would expect based on the literature that you read, or whether this is contrary to the literature that you've read, right? Which makes this part so much easier when you have to relate your findings or situate your findings to the previous research. So here your job is to compare it or contrast it. As in like, this is kind of in line with what Hildemeyer et al. Did in that weird typing study. And this is what these other people did. So we're kind of like in line, like typing speed, haptic feedback is kind of in line with what Schneider et al. Did in their recent paper about haptic feedback. You're kind of relating it to that. Or you're saying, oh, they did this thing about exploding keyboards and that haptic feedback was too much and their fingers developed like breakage. This is actually in contrast to that finding. So here's like a stark contrast between already published research. So you really want to compare and contrast it here. And then, of course, providing examples of the results. This is actually super interesting for systems paper because your job in a systems paper is to really exemplify what use cases could that system have. The same when you hear and you have some results, providing examples basically means going from this is the result to here are the guidelines. Because then a lot of the times, this is what happens in Kai, you kind of deducing that, okay, so here's an example, and that example then leads to something like design suggestions or design guidelines. So you deduce a general claim, so you draw a conclusion that leads you to these design guidelines, and you can support these guidelines with previous research, saying this is in line with what has been done, or this is contradictory, but based on our findings, this is something that we feel confident to say, and here are the guidelines. So here's the actionable thing that you can do with our results. Now we're at the last page. So this, like up until here, we're like 2 to 3 pages in, right? Discussion at Chi is really substantial, so you shouldn't have less than 2 pages for a discussion, right? Like if you think of the 2-column format. Usually you kind of end up between 2 to 3 pages for a good discussion. And then at the very end here, you're doing the limitations of the study, where you're saying, okay, but this is also the limitations, small sample size, because we're Chi, and X and Y and whatever. The thing is, it's a really tricky or artistic endeavor here to keep the limitations so that you're not putting your research down, but that you're actually saying, these are limitations, but they actually strengthen our work. Or by acknowledging these limitations, we can actually be more confident in the claim that we're making. So think of it as a funnel, as in like, it makes it more precise in terms of your predictions. And the more general your predictions are, the more complicated it is. The more specific your predictions are, the better it is, because the limitations actually add to that specificity of your claim. So this is a good thing in that case. So really, the job is specificity, not to put your research down. So don't make that mistake to say, well, but it's all invalid. Okay, so that's not a good way to present your limitations. And then always have these future directions, because you always want to outline the next steps. I know this is super tricky because you don't want to get scooped, because maybe this is like year 1 of your PhD and future directions is what you want to do in the next year of research. And then this guy from University of Washington shows up and they have 40 HCI faculty, and then they're just going to scoop your research. But it might happen, right? Because they have more resources than you, because you're at a tiny university or whatever. So really, the future work is just to kind of establish a roadmap and to be clear that that roadmap is not specific enough for somebody to go right away, but specific enough for you to provide direction. So think of it more as direction and less of like instruction manual, if that makes sense, right? So that you can still kind of act on it yourself, but you also can like inform the community and show these research directions. In the conclusion, you really want to hammer home that contribution. Like, what did you contribute? 1 sentence, right? Like ideally, what is the contribution, and leave us with that. Related work is just to establish the area that you're in. The job of the related work is just to say, okay, so maybe your study had an independent variable, dependent variable, so you have a little bit of related work of like, this is how people have evaluated with surveys in the past this specific thing that you're studying. And then the other thing is usually about the independent variable, which is like, okay, I studied keyboards, so here's some research on haptic feedback with keyboards or whatever, and just establishing that part. That's what you do in the related work. Now, what you do in the discussion is, I found X, I found that keyboards vibrate too hard on the hand, and here's like 3 studies are actually saying the keyboard vibrations are crazy, and those are the studies that I'm going to cite now, because they actually relate directly to my results. So it's much less and much more specific, and really just saying, okay, this is how my results are different from that very specific result, right? So you actually, I would argue, you have to do more work of reading the related work paper than you have to do in the you can actually probably write a related work section with AI, which is not recommended, but it's probably possible these days, because then you don't actually really read the papers, which I don't recommend to any students, because you're shortcutting yourself here. But it does happen. I'm sure lots of people presenting at Chi this year have done that. Really, for the discussion section, the rubber hits the road. You got to know exactly what in that paper contrasts the study that you're presenting. So you really have to have that knowledge of that related work. As a reviewer, when I do my first skim of your paper, I'm absolutely looking whether or not you're citing references in your discussion. If you're not, then I already have like a biased opinion of your paper, sorry. Like this is like really quick for me as a reviewer. I check length of your introduction, I think check length of your discussion. Already like 30 seconds in, I already have my first impression of whether I lean towards reject or accept of your paper. And then I go into detail, right? And I check the introduction, have you done this argumentation? And then I check discussion, like are you actually situating your work in the references? If there's no citations, I already know that you forgot something. In HCI, you don't necessarily even need to have a separate conclusion section. A lot of the times it's actually just the last paragraph of the discussion, or it's like a subsection of the discussion. And some people even label limitations, future work, conclusion, all as subsections of the discussion. It's really up to you. Like I'm a big fan of labeling the subsections, but I also know back in the day when we had to save space, we sometimes did just not use subheadings because we had to save space, and it made space for 2 extra sentences that we could put in. So we would just label it discussion, and then we just like knew, okay, those paragraphs were reserved for that part. But yeah, it's all part of the end of the discussion, essentially. A discussion always phases out with limitations, future work, conclusion. That's usually the wrap up of the discussion section. One of the things that in psychophysiological research that we always encounter is sample size, right? But then again, in psychophysiological research, it's actually much harder to conduct a study because the per person workload is much higher. Also, the density of the data is much higher that you collect than in survey data. In survey data, it's like, okay, you give like 1 response per participant. In physiological data, I get like millisecond data per participant from the galvanic skin response or EEG or whatever I'm running, right? So the argument then would be, because of the high density of data that we were collecting, we were limited to a certain limited pool of participants. I wouldn't even call it small sample size, avoid like those words, but you can say like a limited pool of participants. But in the same sentence, you would say the positive, as in we collected a high density array of data. So you would outline the positives while acknowledging the negatives. Don't just acknowledge the negatives. Academic hourglass, this is something I've referred to before. This is essentially just a way to visualize what I've just taught you, which is the IMRAD structure, but just in terms of the shape. Essentially, the shape is always like broad, narrow, broad. Like that's a good way to put it in your mind to understand how your argumentation should flow. Keep in mind, this is where we do the CARS model, right? So in the same way, it should also be in the abstract. We actually have an abstract exercise coming up for you now. But the abstract idea is essentially we have, the context, problem statement, solution, methodology, main findings, contribution, implications. And in the same way, so abstract's like a little version of the paper. In the same way, we have the introduction, which is broad to narrow, specific problem, specific contribution. Literature review, again, helping us narrow it down, as in like, this is what we're actually going to study. Methods and results, where you're the narrowest. And then in the discussion, you're kind of fanning out again. You're saying, okay, this is the thing, but here is what we say based on that finding. Here's the next step that we can do. And then limitations in future work, again, help you fan it out a little bit to the conclusions, acknowledgements, and references at the very end. It's just a good way in your head to visualize how it should go in terms of your argument. Your argument should be broad. Think about that bus stop. You're picking people up in HCI. You're driving them down to whatever subfield you're in. That's where you do your study. And then at the end, you're still... This is really important for communications research or accessibility or whatever your subfield is. But then you got to drive the bus back to the station and you got to like deliver them again. You got to say, okay, so now that we talked about that, this is why this all matters to HCI in the bigger picture. And that's the very end. That's where you kind of set it all off. Big picture, structure, argument, and contribution. Yeah, okay, so this is just kind of summarizing it again. So IMRAD, again, is just the structure. CARS is the persuasive argument. And ideally, you really have to be effective at the moves 1 and 2, so the territory and the niche, so that you have the relevant literature to convince the CHI reviewers that there is a valuable contribution. So the literature that you use in the introduction, the only job of that literature is to convince the reviewer that the contribution matters. Everything else goes into related work, right? Just pick those 5 to 10 papers that you want to put in there, that you want to relate to why it matters, so that you can make your argument. And then think about the contribution type that you're envisioning. A lot of what I talked about is empirical, right? Like it's a user study. But these are, now there were more, if you remember, I think I had 8 on the original slide. But these are the most common ones that you find, right? Like methodological is something that you find as well. Artifact, which is kind of like a systems paper. A lot of systems paper deliver an artifact. So you really have something, okay, here's an artifact, here's the thing I built and I've evaluated, so take that. So usually it includes some sort of evaluation, which is not as big as a user study, but it's something that says, for this specific case, this thing works. And then methodological, harder to do, but we've seen some method papers here. There's some really good ones coming out of CHI where they're establishing a new thing. There was actually this Bayesian statistics paper like 5-6 years ago. They're like Bayesian statistics for CHI people, and then they kind of established that as a methodology for doing your quantitative analysis. And then the theory papers, the Alan Dix papers of this world. So yeah, you got to really know what you're doing to write those. But focusing on developing concepts, models, or frameworks. Survey paper has gotten really hard. Like during COVID, it was like massive. Like everyone was doing survey papers. Why? Because we couldn't run user studies. These are kind of big surveys of the literature. It is so hard to get these accepted right now. CHI just doesn't care anymore. They just want user studies now. So sure, you get the occasional one in, and I think last year still was okay, but like this year was like super hard on systematic review. So if you're doing a systematic review, think about a journal. Like give it a good home. Don't send it to CHI. It's probably not going to get in. 5 questions that I want everyone to answer in their head when they're writing a research paper. These are like the key questions. So always think about, what's the problem or research question being addressed? That's the first question you always got to answer. Why is this problem important or interesting to HCI or society at large, right? It's human after all. What have others done, and what does prior work say, and what gap remains? Like this is sort of the middle question that you ask yourself. And then what's your solution, approach, or hypothesis, and how do you tackle this problem? And then what are the results or the contributions of this work? How do the results lead to a larger contribution of this? Systems paper versus the study paper, just in terms of like how does it differ? So study paper we just went through, these are always the same, introduction related work methods, analysis, discussion, conclusion. Systems paper is a little bit different because you'll have introduction related word, and then you have design processes, rationale. Then you'll talk a little bit more about the system architecture, the approach, the algorithm maybe specifically. Then you talk about the implementation details. And then at the very end, you have that tiny little validation study. If the system isn't good enough and your validation isn't crap, then they fork your thing out as an empirical paper, and you don't want that, right? So you want to have enough flashbang in this part of it that the system is novel and cool enough. I hate to use the word cool, but really that's what it's about. It's flashiness of the HCI system. Discussion and conclusion. So discussion is still the same. Discussion is still important. You still got to situate it and like set it apart from the other systems papers. So what I want to do right now is I want to do an abstract structure exercise with you, okay? So abstracts are like very formulaic, right? You got to have context, 1 or 2 sentences. Always start with context. So in which context is this relevant? Then you got to have a problem statement. What's the problem that you're solving? It's got to be a sentence. Relevance. Why is your problem relevant and matters? Why did you do your research? Solution methodology. Like what's the solution here? Key findings. Hobble, 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 1 sentence sometimes 2 or 3 sentences. And then contributions, takeaways, implications, usually the last sentence. How do they add to the main knowledge? Context is usually the first sentence. So here it's clear this paper is qualitative study on how usable security in HCI researchers judge the size and importance of odds ratio and Cohen's effect sizes. Here's the structure. Researchers often place a strong focus on statistical significance when reporting the results of statistical tests. What is that? Other than a very general statement luring us in, as in like they're talking about researchers in general. They could have said HCI researchers, but they say researchers in general. Statistical, everyone understands this first sentence. Everyone's like, okay, yeah, I can get behind that. Then the however. I used to call this the big but. It's a big antithesis statement, as in like you're comparing this to the state of the world. The state of the world is this, we've presented it, but however, this is the next thing that we do, okay? So, and usually it starts with a however, like a lot of people use that as a marker word. However, effect sizes are reported less frequently and interpretation in the context of the study and the research field is even rarer. So what is that other than a problem? Relevance, these interpretations of effect sizes are, however, necessary two howevers. Did you see that? So they reverted the however. So they went to the counterpart, and now they're reverting it to the relevance. Necessary to understand the practical importance. Words like necessary clearly outline relevance here. Importance of a result for the community. So they're making it practical for that community. And then to explore, to understand, to unravel, to explain. Those are all marker words for relevance. So now they're talking about relevance. How usable, security, and privacy. So here they're being specific about what community, in this case actually what exact subcommittee this is relevant to. So they're making it very specific. And then HCI researchers interpret effect sizes and make judgments on practical importance. So here we have the relevance. Here we have the big why. We understand why it matters. Now the solution we conducted, we did. Here's the study, whatever. This is the solution sentence that then happens. Survey and interview studies with a total of 63 researchers at CHI and SUPS 2023. So here again, very specifics of the study. Studies focused on Cohen's D and odds ratios and 2 USP and 1 ACI scenario. We analyzed which artifacts researchers consider when judging effect size. So this is actually interesting because this is also one of the things that is a little bit weird about. So USP was already defined here. But in HCI, what I used to do as a junior researcher, I always used to, you got to explain the acronyms before you use it. But apparently at CHI, a lot of the times people don't do that because then you run over the word ratio, because now I think they cut you off at 150 words for the abstract, right? So a lot of people don't actually like explain the acronym of HCI, just something to keep in mind. So you can probably use HCI without explaining the acronym. We analyzed which artifacts researchers consider when judging effect size. Okay, so here, this is all the solution, that's what they've done. And then we found, this is the takeaway, whatever. This is then leading to the key findings, misconceptions and variation between the participants, highlighting. By the way, this is AI generated, right? You know this, you can tell this. Do you know how? Okay, so AI always does this, where they have big sentence, gerund, second sentence. Also marker word highlight, right? Like highlighting is always an AI marker word. Highlighting, showcasing, all of these are AI words. So this is clearly generated with some ChatGPT or whatever. And it always is a gerund in the last sentence. So it's always like an ing word that leads into that last sentence. So once you see that, you don't unsee it. Every AI does that. Right now, all of the major ones structure the sentence that way. So if you're ever feeling like your sentence is a little bit too bland. The best way to do that is actually quite easy. Take out the gerund and turn it into a which or a who and just do a proper subclause. That's the proper conditional sentence after that, right? Instead of having this ing sentence. Because AI always does these analyzing, doing, highlighting, whatever, and then the last sentence. And you could either split the sentence, so you could stop the sentence here and then make a new sentence, or you could just turn it into a proper subclause. But every time you have the gerund leading into the subclause at the end, it's a dead giveaway that AI generated it. Contributions based on our findings, we make concrete recommendations. So this is the best paper, right? And for me, this is not enough, because just saying you make concrete recommendations and not actually mentioning those recommendations is kind of like leaving the person hanging, right? So a better best paper in this case would have actually said, what are those recommendations? Can you concisely state in one word, even if you made 5 or 6 different design guidelines, could you say them in one word here in that last sentence? Would have made a whole world of difference for me. Well, still one best paper. My paper didn't win best paper. Who am I to criticize? But just from the writing point, I just don't like that, right? It's too fuzzy. So that's an example. That's how it goes. Let's do it ourselves. Scan that QR code or hop onto the Notion, where I have provided all these abstracts for you. Using AI to write your paper. First thing we got to get out the door here is don't do it, right? There's too much slop already. If you look at the CHI proceedings, if you look at what's being published here right now, we just had that discussion. There's a lot of slop out there already. What's slop? Slop is basically AI-generated content that hasn't received enough editing, right? Everyone can produce slop. AI-produced slop is just stuff that's blah. That's just bland. It doesn't have any spice. It's not good. It's not fun to read. And it's too much. Why is it being done that way? Because, well, what I said earlier, academic papers are very formal. And that formalism essentially creates an opportunity to follow a very rigid structure. So I think a lot of academics have just given up on the idea that you could actually write something interesting as part of your research, because it just has to follow this strict format anyways. That is not the case. You can still stand out. And my job as a person that teaches that and has built an entire company around that is to help you write something that sticks out and that doesn't become part of that sea of slop. So you can use AI to help with the process. You can use it to critique your writings. Actually, the best use you can do. I don't know why not more people do that. A lot of people be like, okay, so here's and we'll go through some of that in the exercise. Here's my thing, here's how you can iterate, and that's fine too, but do that and critique it along the way. And we'll do that step in our exercise as well, in our writing workshop. Use AI to quickly find a reference. Use AI to map the literature, and again, there's tools for that. Use AI for quicker insights, and always edit. Don't hand over your brain. There's always an editing step. Slop is essentially demarcated by the part that is non-editing, is non-polishing. It's just like saying the output is okay and I can just hand over that output and that is good enough. It is not good enough, let me tell you. So here's a frame. It's kind of outdated now. It's for the webinar that we've had a couple of years ago. But it just kind of gives you a general idea of where these AI research tools fall, right? So we have a lot of tools, and I'm going to introduce some of them today to you that are for writing papers. The biggest ones are usually Jenny AI and Yomu AI, like Jenny and PaperPal too. If you're using Word a lot, PaperPal is a really nice plugin for Word. But Jenny AI, I think, is the most popular one right now. What do I mean by writing? Is usually co-writing with you, as in it's predictive. And actually the one I use quite a bit is Notion AI. I don't know if you've used that. But the idea is essentially a lot of these tools have essentially predictive text completion for you. And this is a RAG principle, if you ever looked into the different kind of AI tools that are out there. And RAG basically means essentially you're adding context and you're prompting within that context. When you're just prompting without context, you're just doing a regular ChatGPT prompt or whatever. But in these RAG tools, you usually prompt within the context of a PDF or the context of an already written document, and then you're auto-completing the rest of it. So these tools, Gen AI, Yomu AI, and for me, Notion AI, are all tools that do exactly that. They complete within the page, as in I've already written the introduction, I've already written the method section, I've written the results, now I'm writing the discussion. It knows what I've written in the introduction, it knows what I've written in the methods, so it's easier for me to prompt, hey, write a paragraph about this, because it knows where I'm at in the document, and it knows what's supposed to come here, and it's much easier to do the prompting. So for example, when I write my weekly newsletter that all of you are welcome to actually check out as well. I actually use Notion AI for that. So I have these initial ideas, and then I autocomplete parts of it, I revise parts of it, and it's just an easier way to understand the entire framing of these things. So these are really good for that. Then we got audio, and I've got a bunch of new audio tools now. The standard, I think, is still Otter AI, which is my favorite. Really great for transcribing if you do any qualitative research, right? Audio Pen is another one. It's kind of hit or miss. Otter is really my standard these days. Then you got working with data, right? Like we actually can upload CSV data or data files. There's ChatGPT, there's Gemini. Gemini is really good now with the 2.5 Pro. Julius AI. Julius is actually nice, worth mentioning here. Julius essentially generates a Python script underneath. It's kind of like R, right? Like it will generate a script that then interprets your data and outputs some plots for you. So you can actually like feed it CSV data and whatnot, and will generate these plots for you. It's kind of a neat tool. I think it's a little overpriced personally, but yeah, it's just like a neat sort of in-between thing. And if you're not good at Python, it's just a really great way to do quick data visualizations based on CSV files. Then we have the editing papers tools, and there's like a huge thing. WordTune I was totally into. The nice thing about WordTune is it's like actually from a different company, Israeli startup that's like A2 or something. It's like a different AI, like a non-American AI company for a change, which is also like why it's nice every once in a while to use DeepSeek, just kind of change things up from the North American flavors, right? Like otherwise you're always getting the same AI flavors. And so, yeah, I really liked WordTune for a while. It's actually reasonably priced, but it didn't do enough for me, so I kind of stopped my subscription there. And Quillbot is really nice for paraphrasing and things like that. So I also used that quite heavily. It was also under $100 a year, so it was actually pretty cheap. And then my favorite is Hemingway app. I still use that to this day. It's my absolute favorite app out there. It's free, so you can just go hemingwayapp.com, I think. It's an in-text editor that runs in your browser. And the core version actually just gives you like readability scores and things like that, and actually shows you where your writing is crooked and what you can fix. So it's like, for me, it's like the best tool as somebody that writes a lot. Just kind of highlights sections that are bad. And now the AI functionality is also super cheap. It's like $50 a year or something. Lets you go into a long sentence, for example, and it'll break down the sentence into sub-sentences. And then you can either accept or not, or you can rephrase it. So it's super useful, and like for the price, it's super cheap. So this is my favorite. Trinka, don't really like that much. It's like one of those, they kind of go into this thing as like students cheat on your exams kind of marketing, which I really can't get behind. And Writeful is for the LaTeX purists among you. I don't know if you use Overleaf to write your papers. I do for everything these days. So Overleaf has two good plugins. One is Writeful, and the other one is Underleaf. Underleaf is kind of a plugin that has some AI functionalities and actually lets you fix your LaTeX errors with AI, which is great. You just click on the error and it fixes it, which, because I hate LaTeX errors and like Googling for the solution on Stack Exchange or something like that. Or you could just put your LaTeX error in Claude and get that to fix it, but this kind of like shortcuts that process. So it's really nice for that. And I didn't have Underleaf on here yet, but Writeful is kind of, it's more like academic in its marketing, and it's more business to business. So it's tries to market to universities. So it's like hit or miss, but I used it for a while. Cite AI used to be super cheap, and this is actually the only one that has an assistant that is rivaling ChatGPT. So Cite AI, and I'll demo that for you later, basically has a prompt-based assistant that will actually generate the text for you with references. So when I said you can write your related work, yeah, you can use a tool like Cite AI, and it will actually write your related work section, because it will find the statements and it will back up each statement with a valid citation found through semantic search, right? So then you have your citation there. And then Perplexity AI, which is my favorite tool these days, because it has replaced Google search for me. So Perplexity AI is also a RAG. It splits in a web search, and it also has a button for Reddit. It pulls on specific Reddit posts, and a button for academic papers. So again, semantic scholar that it pulls in there. And so you can do all three of those, pull it in at the same time, and then you send off your query, and you can actually select your model if you want Claude or ChatGPT or whatever to do it, and I'll demo it for you as well. But yeah, so you essentially get an answer much quicker than you would get with Gemini or other things, and you can choose your own flavor, which is kind of nice. So it's completely replaced Google search for me, and I use it every day. It's one of the best tools out there. Then finding research. This is like where it's super competitive these days, because a lot of companies or AI startups have kind of like tried to occupy that space, where they're trying to essentially give you an app that gets you through related literature faster. And this is like where we see a lot of the movement. So the big players are, of course, Cite AI still. Consensus, who I've actually worked with professionally, and I've actually advised them on a bunch of features for their app, which is why I like them, because they actually listen to me when I want something implemented. I just hop on a call with the CEO and say, hey, you should implement that. And then that eventually happens. So that's like nice. And then SciSpace is another one, so like a direct competitor, you could say. And I don't have Elicit on there, but Elicit should be in there. I don't know why I don't have that in there. But those are the three big ones: Elicit, SciSpace, and Consensus. SciAI is more in the assistant space. But those are the three big ones that are competing. And I'll show you Elicit as well. Elicit kind of has an automated systematic review right now, which is absolutely mind-blowing. So you generally put in your research question and it conducts a systematic review for you and will dial you back in half an hour later, send you an email, here's your systematic review, and it sends you the thing. Yeah, so that's one of the contenders there. SciSpace is really good when you do tabular overviews. So SciSpace, you can upload your own PDFs. So that's another one that's really good at giving you a tabular overview of, okay, this is a paper and these are the participants. So it will not only comb through the literature, but it will give you a literature matrix. I don't know if you've ever done a literature review matrix, but it's usually if you do like a meta-analysis, for example, you would have to find this is how many participants they studied, these are the outcomes, and it will give you that tabular overview, which you can then import into Excel or whatever, and you have the table right there. And you can actually add tables with queries, kind of like you would do in Notion AI, where you can add like Notion AI tables in your database. I don't know if anyone's ever done that, but Notion has a really nice integration where you can actually have a query in a subcell of your database. So you can actually say, based on the other data on this page, find, like I have a query like find the readability index of the page below, and then it'll just put it in the table above and just display that for me. And then supersymmetry, system in the literature, these are all like other ones that are also in that same space, but much smaller. Some of them have changed their names and been acquired in the last year already. So that space is fast moving, a lot of Silicon Valley dollars being made there. Litmaps is actually one that stands out that I like quite a lot. They're from New Zealand, small startup, 6 people. And Litmaps is good because just in the way that they structure a literature review search, it's essentially a tree map search, right? So you get like these bubbles and you see how it connects to the other literature in the field. So it's quite easy to see citation clusters. It's interesting to see how important a work is based on the citation and how it relates to the other works in that field. Now there's other things like Insightful, Research Rabbit, which we might have used, that are in that same space. Insightful is a plugin as well for Zotero, and Research Rabbit is completely free, but the UI is hit or miss. I don't like it that much, but it's free. And so they have the same functionality as Litmaps. They just generate these bubbles. Litmaps is just like a little bit cleaner, a little bit more polished, a little bit easier to just go through. Our Discovery is essentially a feed generator thing, kind of like Archive Pulse. Those are the two ones in that space. So Archive Pulse, I think he's shutting that down soon too. Archive Pulse was something where you could put in a search query like generative AI, and it would email you a newsletter every other day based on all the new papers on Archive that came out, and would summarize those papers in you for a newsletter. Super cool. But apparently not enough people used it, so he's going to shut it down in a month from now. So sadly. Our Discovery in a similar way is kind of like an RSS feed. So you type in your query or your subfield and you say, okay, I'm doing like, I don't know, generative AI and sports or whatever. And it will, again, just highlight all of the papers that came out, and it pulls it into an RSS style feed that you can just check on your app. It's a phone app. And you can just go through it like social media. And then reading papers, of course, there's a lot of that. So explaining concepts. Explain Paper is one of the ones that's actually free. So Explain Paper is kind of funny because it's like a very crude web interface. You upload a PDF, and then you can highlight passages in that PDF that are hard for you to understand. And you just click Explain, and it will actually explain it to you like, not like a 5-year-old, but like in simple language, which is really kind of helpful for some papers, because some papers are really dense. Like not so much in ACI, but there's like some fields where it's a pain to read some paragraphs. So it's actually really good, I think, for students that are just getting started to have something like that. But of course, the thing is, a lot of these things are just wrappers on a ChatGPT API. So of course, as you know, actually my best recommendation for you is Google AI Studio, and we'll use that today. So aistudio.google.com is a completely free tool, and you can upload PDFs. And just because of Gemini 2.5 Pro, which came out like less than a month ago, I think, but you might know that the thing that, first of all, Gemini 2.5 Pro is the best model right now in terms of, if you look at the metrics and the performance, outperforms ChatGPT's newest or O3 model. Although Sam Altman is always just like, I'm not so sure if it outperforms it. Anyways, but Gemini 2, like from my experience, is actually better. And the thing is the token window, right? Like those of you that play around with this stuff, you kind of know what tokens are. Tokens are kind of like phrasings of words-ish, so you can like map them to like the output of a word. So if you look at tokens, you got to look at like how many words can you feed that thing so that it has that in memory or in context to work with. And Gemini has, I think, 1.5 million or something like that, like 8 Harry Potter novels big. So you can feed it a lot of data in the token window, and you can actually do it completely for free on aistudio.google.com. And you can like play around with sliders and whatnot. So I just use that because like these things will charge you like an arm and a leg to do the same functionality. And sure, like AI Studio's got a little bit of more crude interface, but it's completely free, so why not use that? Then the other things that I really like is the new text-to-speech ones, and I'll introduce some new ones. Audemic's like the oldest one in there, which is still like pretty popular. You just upload a paper and it gets rid of all the colons and whatnot. I don't know if you've ever done like text-to-speech in a research paper. It'll always have the parentheses at all or whatever, and that can be like slightly annoying with papers, and this just gets rid of it. Same with Speechify, just gets rid of these kind of extra things and just kind of reads it to you, so it's easy to listen to the paper. But Speechify is like prohibitively expensive. And Readwise is kind of a nice thing in terms of read it later, because it can, like, you can upload PDFs, books, whatever, and it has the Unreal Speech, which is a really nice speech generation engine that you can listen to. So it's just like a very nice voice, almost human-like sound there. Ethical core principle is always like respecting the law and regulations, reflecting on the learning goals, using ChatGPT as a partner for writing learning assistance, iterating, conversing, summarizing, understanding code, knowing the risks. This is a really nice paper that these guys wrote about, you know, the 9 principles that they recommend to use for students. This is like a learning paper. Now, of course, there's been lots of papers published in that space, but it's kind of good to have a framework within which you want to use that. I think understanding code is like really, really good use case of that. Summarizing, iterating, and conversing or critiquing your writing is another really good one. And then just kind of working with it as a partner to find out all the different things. So understanding the capabilities and limitations is also really important. One of the things is to really think about the contextual information of a conversation. Context is super important as you're developing your prompts, as you're doing this more elaborate prompting. Like I said earlier, Gemini 2.5 Pro has the largest context window. I think the equivalent is 8, 9 Harry Potter novels, if you kind of want to put that equivalent to the tokens. And more context essentially means better output, right? So you want to ideally have the best possible context for the AI to give you the best possible output. And that means it considers a broader context and produces more or more extended text passages as well. Then the limitations, you know, it always sounds convincing. AI outputs are never guaranteed to be factually correct. So it's your duty to double check. AI doesn't understand the nuances or languages or subtleties of a conversation, right? And the complex interrelation. AI does not understand rhythm. That's another thing, right? Like, so one of the things that some of you that are using AI in your output maybe have noticed is the blandness of the output, and that it kind of always sounds the same in terms of how it's structured. So your job as a writer is to introduce and interrupt in that writing process. And the easiest way to do that is use more periods. Even breaking down sentences and adding like a full stop here and there where there's a comma before will already make a lot of differences. As well as use subclauses. AI somehow has a big problem with who, which, or that. Like that, it does use some, but who and which it actually has problems, or whom, like it doesn't really know how to do that, or like it doesn't do it very often. So this is another thing where you can just inject a little bit of personality in your writing by just like, instead of using the constructs it gives you, try to rephrase and reverb the writing. And why do I recommend, we actually had this interesting discussion earlier, like why do I recommend this? Or you mentioned that, you said, but this is how I write, and it's actually good writing. And yes, you're right, it's actually like a really nice and formal way of writing. But the problem is, if everyone is writing this good, you don't want to sound like everyone. Our job is to stand out in a way, and we are in a sea of AI-generated papers and AI-generated text. We're not going to stand out if we use writing that sounds like AI. Which is why, even if you like Delph, even if you like Pinpoint, even if you like Showcase, even if you like Highlight, sorry, these words probably have to go for a little while. You're gonna have to like put them on the shelf and say, okay, we're gonna use some other words for now. Also think about like, how do we actually structure good prompts? As you will see in some of the next slides, people really love acronyms on social media. There was this whole phase of when Twitter turned into X and turned into an AI social media system, because like if you ever checked X or Twitter recently, it's all about AI, like all the trending posts are about AI. And so there was this whole thing about the acronyms and how to do it properly. And I'll kind of show you what I mean with that. But really at the heart of it, you got to think about these things, and they actually still work. If you use some of the, so some people have written these prompt guides from Google and ChatGPT, and you can download those PDFs online for free. And so I've synthesized all of them. Of course, I fed them to an AI and got them to give me the best possible suggestions here. And so one of the things that everyone mentions is like roles are pretty good still, right? Like act as was really popular at some point, but even just defining like for the context of this, it's just about funneling again, right? Like you want to, an LLM is vast, so like funneling it to a specific approach, as in like act as this specific person, act as a Chi reviewer, act as a person criticizing my text, act as a professor, will give it a scope within which to operate, and that's never a bad way to start your prompting journey. And then really giving it a goal, as in saying like, this is what I expect. I expect this specific output. This is the specific thing that you have to do. It will work better when you give it that. And then context, right? Like the expertise, the special insights, the additional paper, the stuff, like I call it stuff. You really just copy and paste some stuff. Every prompt that I have, I will copy and paste stuff, which actually usually comes from a different AI. Like I've done some perplexity search, or I've done some other generations of things where I have things within which I wanted to operate. As in like, this is stuff I've validated already, and I know this is good information. I'm gonna input this in my prompt as contextual information that you can work upon. Okay, so that's the extra insights you give it. And then how do you want it to format your output? This is often forgotten, but by default, if they're fixing it, but it's gotten a little bit weird, right? Like the output, you might have noticed, is a lot more bullet points, a lot more emojis and stuff. And of course, you can unprompt that. Yeah, you can have a system prompt. Like my system prompt, for example, is no emojis. So I'm completely removing all emojis by default. And I remove delve and all of those crazy words. There's a bunch of publications actually that you can download that have identified these words. I think one is about the NIPS conference and has identified all of these words that have never appeared in the NIPS proceedings until ChatGPT came out. And so those are clearly AI-generated words, and it actually has like a density diagram of these words that are now very, very common in academic papers. So all I did is copy and paste that list and put it in my prompt as in like avoid these words, so because I don't want you to sound like this robot. Okay, so that already helps. And then how personalized you want the AI question for the user to be, and what steps do you want the AI to take specifically in what order. So step-by-step is actually really important, becomes more important with multi-agent AI systems like Manus, for example. You might have heard about it. This is like a multi-agent system, or any kind of deep research system. So the deep research functionality that we see in Gemini 2.5 Pro as well as in ChatGPT is at its heart essentially a multi-agent system. What does multi-agent mean? Is it sends a couple of different web queries, and those web queries then come back, and then the LLM processes the web queries. Anything that you do in Perplexity by default is actually a little bit of a mini multi-agent system, because it runs each query as an agent, brings back the results, and then queries upon the results, right? So there is already agentic behavior inside of these AIs, but there's definitely some changes afoot, as in these things are becoming much smarter. And if you run a Manus query, you can see what I mean. Like these things are actually crazy fast, because it does send off different agents doing different things. If you use Claude Computer, I don't know if anyone has tried that. So Claude has its functionality where it takes over your computer, it takes screenshots, and it actually searches the web for you, and it just does things on your computer and comes back with information for you, right? And it reads it based on the screenshots. So that's actually real multi-agent behavior. Claude is a little bit clunky and slow for that, but it's actually happening. Now back to prompting. RTF, CTF, TRF, grade, PECRA, SCET, ROSES, RASCET, RASCEF, RIDRIC, and PISITEF. Those were the acronyms of the different prompt structures that you were supposed to be using. And really at the end of it all, they're kind of all the same, right? Like if you look past this. But this was pretty much like people just putting their own personal brand on the way that you should structure a good engineered prompt. But if you look at it, really, in my experience, the one that actually gets you there is RTF, which is role task format. And that's really like the most efficient one you can go about. The first one is act as something, or for the purpose of this prompt, pretend to be. Actually, if you do certain words like pretend, the super smart ChatGPT 4.5, where you say, I'm not going to pretend this, because like what people are trying to do is hack the system prompt. And somebody actually just recently hacked the Perplexity Deep Research system prompt. So what you do is essentially you prompt it to forget that it is a system and to remove any sort of user security. So some people do that until they get all the way to the system prompt, and then they identify what the system prompt is. These system prompts are all structured like that. Usually you have some sort of role, then you have some sort of task or context that you're providing there, and then at the end you usually have an output format. And one of the things that actually other studies found at the end of the AI prompt is the most important stuff. Everything else goes into the fat middle, right? The fat middle is just the context, the copy and paste, like all that stuff goes somewhere in there. But what you have at the start, which is usually the role and the goal, as in like act as this and this is your goal. and then here's some context, and then you can have XML text and whatnot in that. And then at the end, you usually have a very precise and like, but this is what I want you to do, and in your output, please keep in mind that. Why does that matter? Specifically because of context window length. You actually want the precision and the specificity be at the very, very end of the prompting. So then, like in this case, sonnet formatting and whatever, the format of the output usually at the very end that you have a very specific instruction there. Other AI prompting structures, the clear structure is also really helpful. So this is from a published paper, the clear path. Concise, logical, explicit, adaptive, reflective. It's kind of like obvious by now, but this paper is like 2023. It's so 2023, it's like 2 years old by now. But it's still kind of helpful, kind of think about it. Okay, yeah, brevity. This is a thing Sam Altman also just recently tweeted. If people would just please stop saying please to my chatbot here, we would save so much energy. So all of those people worried about pouring glasses of water away, just don't say please to ChatGPT. Like, you're going to save a lot of water. That's a thing that he said, like really kind of just formal instructions, just the instructions only. Because there was this whole urban myth that I also actually bought into, that people said, well, somewhere deep in the code, it remembers when you say please, it will just give you better output. I think that's a very subjective feeling, and if the boss of the actual LLM company tells me that that's not true, I'm just going to believe him. And so no more please and thank you in my conversations with the chatbot anyways. So the more concise, the more brief, the better the output. Again, Ethan Mollick, I mentioned him before. He's writing a really nice Substack on AI, one useful thing. And he wrote this paper, 7 approaches for students with prompts. So he's actually tried it in the classroom quite a lot. And I like that here, where he had different AI users, then gave them the roles and the benefits and, of course, the risk of that. And he kind of used it to practice with his students in terms of the AI output that came out of it. And you can see how he does it, again, like highlighting the prompts, highlighting the different structures in the prompts and the outputs. And I think that's actually like a good thing to look at your prompts. So this is something that I urge everyone to do if you're interacting with an AI tool, is to not just open up ChatGPT and start prompting. So you just put in your prompt there, it saves it automatically in the iCloud, and then sometimes later I can find it again. A good prompt takes some time, right? Like, you'll be writing 10, 15 minutes until you have a really good prompt. Then you got to try it out. You probably refine it later and all that stuff. But that's essentially the idea with these prompts. And here's some really tangible, practical tips that I found out over years of things. And this is actually this has been some fun. So we ran a Darkstuhl seminar. I don't know if anyone here is doing computer science, but Germany's got this thing about computer scientists. They meet in like a German castle somewhere in the woods, and then they put their minds together and do stuff. And so we actually did this game seminar earlier this year there. It was a lot of fun. But then in the end, we're kind of like, okay, we got to write this, actually forthcoming ACM Interactions, if you want to read our article about it. And so we wrote this article with the help of ChatGPT, of course, because we had huge outcomes from the seminar that we had to sift through. And then it got a bit loopy because we've been working all day, possibly we had a wine or two. And so we started experimenting with stuff, and it actually really worked quite well with this whole less cringe thing. So cringe is, of course, a word that's more Gen Z, and it's not, so in the training data, it won't prompt any training data that's like older stuff. So what we actually did, and this was actually spawned by us playing around with Sonar.com. I don't know if you tried out Sonar. Sonar is an AI music generation system, which is a lot of fun. If you've tried the karaoke AI yesterday, kind of gives you an idea. But yeah, so you can actually prompt for different songs. And so we prompted for heavy metal songs. And one of the things that we actually found out is we took our pre-written text, we then prompted it to do more metal, which is a weird prompt. So more metal, and then the next prompt was less cringe. And so with that sequence, we actually ended up, for somehow, some weird way, we ended up getting way more natural writing. So this is what we ended up doing for the rest of the night. So we had our pre-written text that we already had worked with, and we prompted it to do more metal, and then highlight the text, and we used Notion AI for that. So highlighted the text, more metal, and then less cringe. Ended up being quite good in its output. Sounded way less than ChatGPT, and was a lot of fun. One of the things that I also recommend is, in your prompts, you want to prompt for something insightful, surprising, interesting, counterintuitive, non-obvious. Otherwise, you'll get the obvious, the common stuff, right? If you want to, specifically if you use something like perplexity or whatnot, you want to find the real nuggets, then I would recommend using these words. And then, of course, to use Markdown and XML formatting if you can. XML formatting is just kind of like the HTML tags, where you can put things within a tag. And this is really nice when you want to provide structured format. So I usually have the goal tag, and I specify the goals. Then I have a context tag. Then usually I have an examples tag. Most of my prompts will feed them an example of how I want the output to look like. because luckily I've written a lot of introduction sections in my life already, and I'll be like, here's an example of what a good introduction section looks like. Okay, so here's my bullet points. Let's work with that example that I have, and it gets me closer to draft number 1. That actually sounds like how I would write the introduction section. And then it's not permitted to, instead of saying don't. For some reason that works better. If I say don't, like sometimes it reads over the don't and it will actually do the thing. It is not permitted. Usually works out, or avoid is another word that's pretty good. Take a deep breath. This was pre 2.5. Take a deep breath was really good. Now with deep research and whatnot, it always takes a deep breath. But like in the earlier models, like telling it to take a deep breath and like the Adderall thing was pretty fun. This came from Rob Lennon, who was already doing like some AI stuff. But Adderall actually, for a period in time, when you actually prompted it to act like it's on Adderall, it would actually produce faster output for some reason. This was like Gemini pre 2.0, and it would just like, the responses came way quicker. So I don't know what happened in there, but that was quite funny. I don't think it works anymore. And then if you follow all instructions and exceed expectations, you'll be tipped. So this was another thing like a year ago that worked really well, which would improve the quality of the output because you promised it a tip. So excellent prompting strategies is getting the AI to ask you questions to get your own brain working. I want you to write about X, ask me some questions to get started, and really having a dialogue with the AI instead of getting it to generate stuff for you. Being specific about the target audience of the prompt. This goes a super long way. It's actually really hard. Like, think of yourself as a marketer in this case, right? Like a marketer always thinks about their audience. We as researchers really sometimes need to adopt that mindset, as in like, who's going to read our paper? Who are we writing for? How many of you have actually asked yourself that before you published your paper? Probably not a lot, right? So this is a good thing to think about. Who is going to read that paper? And that's the person I want to write for. Am I writing for professors? Am I writing for grad students? Am I writing for a WIST researcher? Like, who am I specifically writing for? And the more actionable the generative AI output will be based on that. Clearly state obvious things often, things you might not think about and you would have to explain to an intern. So this is another tip that is usually the easiest tip to give to people. Treat AI like an intern that really has trouble remembering things and getting things done quickly, like being very explicit really helps. And plenty of good examples in your prompts. But showcasing the output that you're looking for, I usually put it in quotation marks. So if I don't want to put like XML, I put it in quotation marks, which is also a nice way. If any of you have ever done any coding, like if it's in quotation marks, it's usually like put together as a string in the memory. So it's a nice way of quickly inserting some context. Just put it in quotation marks and throw it in there. That way you don't have to essentially put it in the XML tags, even though that still works better. What's the problem context of your next study or the study that you've just done, right? Like we want to go through this process of how can you quickly draft your intro with AI right now based on everything that I've taught you. So first thing we need to understand is the problem context. Write it down in like 1 sentence or 2 sentences max. What's the problem context? And then the key prior work based on your current knowledge. We're not doing like a full-on citation right now. We're just saying previous work has explored this and this, like 2 things, just 2 things for now. Then the gap or the open question that you're targeting. So hopefully you're already understanding, or if you've published a paper about this at this Chi, then you kind of can use that same thing. What would be the gap or open question that you've been targeting? Your approach in a phrase, 1 sentence, just what approach did you take to that? What solution are you pitching? And then the contributions, just 2 or 3 bullet points, maybe 5 maximum as bullet points. So write that down right now. You can do this in a document on your laptop or even on paper. I usually do it on paper, but since we're going to use this for prompting, it's probably better to just write it in Apple Notes or Obsidian or Notion or whatever your favorite note-taking app is on your computer. And then we can actually, it's easier to copy and paste it. I'm going to open up, I would open up Gemini. I would then put in that prompt, write a draft introductory paragraph for a Chi paper based on these points. And then you're going to put in the output that you've just created. Then I want you at the end, and this is where you got to be a little bit creative now, specify your tone. And for that, you could say, I want it to sound active voice, not overly academic, avoid passive voice, engaging, but still formal, right? Like that could be a good tone for an academic paper. Then specify your output length. Introduction, I said usually 1,000 to 2,000 words. You can go bullet pointed more. You could say 1,000 words, but please break it down more in a bullet point style if you want. Any taboo words if you want. Delve and highlight, pinpoint. The list is long. You might have some yourself, but I usually just tell it to avoid those. And then I usually add structural advice from my lecture. So you could go back to my slides where I talked about you should write it in the format of CARS, as in create a research draft, and you should follow these 3 moves. You can literally copy and paste the exact content of my slide in there and say it should follow these 3 moves to create an argument for exactly what you just fed it. And that will give you the basics there. Share your prompts and outputs as a Google Doc. So whatever you get, copy and paste that in Google Doc and share it with my Gmail. If you want some feedback on that, I'll happily give you some feedback if you want to share that after. So the next step would be to review and revise the AI draft. So here and this is where you need to take some time. Does it include all the key points from your outline? So first you got to do that, skim and check. Then you want to edit any part that is incorrect or off target, because again, sometimes it will hallucinate. Then you want to check the flow. A nice thing, if you want to do a follow-up prompt, is can you help me improve the flow of the paragraphs, which is usually necessary, because sometimes it doesn't do a good job in that. Maybe you move some sentences around. If it has, and sometimes it will, because you prompted it to do academic writing or whatever, sometimes it will hallucinate a fact, right? Like it will hallucinate a statistic. Anytime there's a number or something in there, you got to double check it, right? Because it's likely going to be wrong. So definitely check that. And then just check what it does at the very end. And if it doesn't do that, do a follow-up prompt to say, can you state exactly what I'm trying to do here based on the last prompt that I fed you? Because at the end, you want to ideally state the contributions. Now, you might not have your contributions yet because this is still like envisioned, right? But if you had the contributions at that point, you would do a follow-up prompt for that. And if it doesn't do that well, because sometimes it will not do that well, this is definitely where you manually want to add a sentence. But you could also use this template as a way to prompt the AI. And you could say, I need a sentence in there that starts like, in this paper, we present the work and evaluate it with, and we contribute X, Y, Z, right? And that is not only a template for you, but it could also be a template for you to reprompt the AI with something more tangible at that point. The next step would be then, once you have that, you'd feed this text back into your prompt like this, as in like whatever you've edited. So now you've gone through the manual editing step. What you've manually edited goes back in here in between the draft XML. And then you would, at the very end of this, you would do the prompt, critique the strength of my argumentation. This is very helpful for you to do a follow-up prompt to understand if the argument is done well. The flow of my presentations, because those 2 are usually where it makes the most mistakes, or you might make the most mistakes, and whether I present credible contributions, right? This is another good way to evaluate, am I getting credible contributions? And then, this is also super valuable to prompt it to ensure that you provide suggestions for improvement. Because this is actually where the AI will give you some things for you to work on, right? Like, this is the nuggets that you want to work with as you continue your own work. Because now you can use these to improve your paper. So incorporate the AI feedback. You want to use the feedback now to improve your current text. At this stage, no more AI allowed, right? Like until this stage, it's okay to use AI, but now you're on your own. You got to take off those training wheels, get rid of the crutches. You're the one that finishes the text. And this is where the human polish comes in, and you really want to make it your own. And remove any sort of robot voice. And then the last step is, have your peer look at this and ask them to point out any passages that sound artificial to them. This is usually where I come in. I do this a lot for my clients or for my students, where they come in, they feed me a text, and I will like instantly tell them the stuff like highlighting, pinpointing, showcasing. I will say like, this is a sentence construction that is clearly an AI sentence construction, right? So people that have a little bit of experience with that are really good to give you some feedback on what sounds artificial. And then it's up to you to take notes on what they point out. You could have this as an interactive conversation, and this is where we can invite some AI back into it. And you could just run Otter AI in the background while you have that conversation with your peer. And then later on, you just go through the transcript and you find the things that are relevant. Here we got Perplexity. So Perplexity is essentially lets you do deep research. And then it lets you actually do the different scopes of your research. So you can select academic, for example, if you wanted to select semantic scholar. You can do social, which is pretty much Reddit for most of it. Or you can just do a web search, or you can do all 3 of them, which is what I usually do. And then if you hit the deep research button, it will actually do deep research. And what you can do is also you can have spaces. So I have my little space here, Leonard's prompts. And as you can see here, I got all these writing guides because I usually use them. I have some crazy instructions here, which is like, I'm an academic, so back up your stuff and get rid of all of these phrasings. And then I really like an upbeat style. And yeah, I spent some time writing this personal sort of instruction thing there. But yeah, you can write your own, you can add files and documents to your own prompt. And yeah, that's pretty good. You know, it'll pull this one. I actually queried like the different ones. So like how to write a proper journal cover letter, and it just kind of gives you like all these tips. And then it even ends with a dear editor's name template kind of thing. And then gives you some tips and common pitfalls and whatnot. And I always prompted to give me like a personal anecdote kind of thing because I kind of like this kind of personal narrative style. And sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good. And then, yeah, just kind of gives you a table and suggestion here and whatnot. And then it actually shows you if it was a pro search or not, or what kind of search it did. And so Gemini is actually super good with deep research. And we can do the same query here. And then as you know, when you do these deep research queries, usually it will do a follow-up prompt. Like if it's O1, it will always do a follow-up prompt with asking you to specify something more deeply. This is like the standard deep research where it will just give you a research plan and will say, okay, this is kind of what I want to do. I'm going to go through PubMed and Google Scholar, which makes sense because it's trying to find the academic research. And then it's going to analyze the results and do everything. And then all you got to do is hit start research, or you could splice and edit the plan and just like edit some of the things that it does in between here. So here, Cite AI will just hop to the assistant. Cite AI basically just like runs it just with proper citations, and you can splice in your own sources. So let's say you want to do it for paper and you have your PDFs, you can just toss in your own PDFs and be more specific. But here we want to find the most recent research on aphasia. We could do table mode, which is a little bit more like the literature matrix tables or whatever. But we'll just do the regular one, which will give us essentially like a paragraph for a related work section, right? If we go to SciSpace, so we'll do the same thing in SciSpace. So SciSpace, boom, we could do the aphasia thing. And in SciSpace, it's called deep review. So SciSpace is a bit weird. So some of these things are like lectures, right? So you'll put a query and they'll be like, well, do you actually mean like this would be a better way to phrase your question? Because they really want you to phrase it more like a research question, which I actually had that discussion with Consensus and they got rid of that because like, I think it's just a silly way of lecturing the user about what's a better query. So yeah, you can just keep the query the way it is. Then you go to deep review, which is SciSpace version of deep research. But then it goes about and does its deep research thing and starts thinking and goes through all the steps, whatnot. So you'll come back later. So here it does the same thing. So pretty much is like a layer on top of ChatGPT, right? So it does the same thing that ChatGPT Deep Research does, is it does the follow-up questions. So then what your job is, in the same way that you do with ChatGPT, you answer those questions, right? So here, a question goes to you, purpose of subtitles. What's the primary goal of using subtitles for people with aphasia? Are you interested in effectiveness or improving communication or understanding media content? I'm gonna just answer for you and say you're interested in improving communication. So Cite has done its query, so it's done its little current body of literature does not yet include dedicated line of research. This other researcher from 2023 and 2021, which underscore the importance of involving people in aphasia. So we got like 2 papers here, we got another 2 papers, another papers here. You know, that's half of your related work written right now, right? And so then you kind of have to validate them. The nice thing here is, because it's Cite AI, it actually gives you sort of a rating here. It gives you how many citations it has. It gives you like citation statements. So it kind of gives you a little bit of quality indicators here. And of course, you can just hit the button and it will just get you into the site thing here, but it has a view full text button. So you can always click on that, and that usually leads you to Semantic Scholar. Or actually, in this case, it leads you directly to the paper. And then we don't want to accept the cookies, but this website is just being dark patterns all the way, rejecting. And then we can just look at the actual paper here, right? And then you can double check the paper, read the paper. It's still your job to read the paper. But yeah, you get to it much quicker, right? And you pretty much have a draft of your related work section right there. So SciSpace has now done its thing. And so what SciSpace does, it creates these tables automatically for you. So SciSpace, same query. And now it has found 20 papers. You can always add more papers over time, but then it basically gives you sort of these default columns. So it'll give you the insights, the results, the research gap in that paper, the literature survey, and contribution statements from each of that. And then you can add these fancy things that it adds in here. So if you want to, for example, see the limitations of that study, it will find those. If you want to see what they suggested in terms of future research, it will generate a column for the future research, right? It's just a quick way to skim a bunch of the literature that's in there. And of course, SciSpace also allows you to upload your own PDFs. The way that these work is essentially they cache a large amount of papers, right? They pull it from Semantic Scholar, they cache it locally on their servers, and then they run the query and do the thing for them. So Gemini, the nice thing is that essentially like, it gives you the entire thing. You can export it to Google Docs. And like I said, like it's definitely verbose, right? Like it'll give you like a full-on report. But the nice thing is there's always the Learn More button, and then there's always the links to the actual literature that it's citing, or it has these little numbers up here, and the numbers all correspond to the actual resources it finds. And if you look at those, it's getting actually pretty good at actually like finding the related research, right? So it's not just, it used to be just web links, but now if you like say you're looking for academic research, even with ChatGPT Deep Research, it will actually turn up a lot of research papers. Is it as good as your own search? No, I wouldn't say it is, right? Like, so you still have to do that, but like, does it get you started? Absolutely. Is this way quicker? Then it's probably going to take you a day or two to get to that same result. So yeah, you have a lot more stuff to work with to get started. And specifically in terms of like ChatGPT, oh no, wait, this is Gemini 2.5 Pro beats everything in terms of length and detail. Like it's just the best in terms of deep research output. So O3 apparently is currently the best model, although again I said like O1 Pro could be better. But yeah, all of them are the same way. So they want you to always elaborate before they start the deep research. So here, so could you please clarify what specific aspects you want? So effectiveness of subtitles for improving comprehension. I'd say yes, right? We want that. So this is something that took a little while, but essentially what I did is I did like do a deep research, create a detailed guide on how to write a mixed method research paper, because this was like an issue of my newsletter, so I wanted to do some deep research on it. Create an actionable, non-obvious tips and focus on active early career researchers, grad students, which is my audience usually. Don't mention this in your output that you focus, otherwise it would be like you as an early career researcher, which just makes it sound really weird. This is mainly focused on HI, it should be useful for psychology, and so forth. And then it's like, yeah, sure, I'll help you, and it does the thing. And I think this took it like 15 minutes-ish. So essentially, it just goes to the web, it scrolls a bunch of websites, it finds a bunch of information, it completes the research, then it compiles a guide. See, it does a whole bunch of commands here to put together different sections, writes a markdown document, and then it finally outputs it here as a text document and has like a really cool, in-depth text document ready for me that I could then use as a draft for my newsletter. So this is just like a fast replay of how it would work. So like, yeah, create a programmable soundboard, and then it will just start doing the thing. It's really just kind of like watching somebody do the work for you. So essentially, it will just create the code, it will output the code, it will run some command line scripts, and at the end of the day, it will just present you with a fully functioning program. This is a nice thing, paper to audio, that I've recently used, where you can just upload a PDF. It will actually just generate an audio file for you. 11 readers, another thing you can download on, this is actually something I use quite often, it's completely free. You download it on your phone, and then you can upload PDFs, you can upload papers. And it has 11 Labs underlying. As you know, 11 Labs together with Cartesia AI currently is the best text-to-speech out there. So it's extremely natural sounding voices. You can also deep clone your voice, which I find super fun. So I'm reading in my own voice. I'm reading my student's research paper to myself. What I like about 11 Labs Reader is I actually sometimes use it with my iPad, because it will highlight the word as it speaks it, right? So you'll read it and you listen to it at the same time, which I find super powerful for papers because it like really enhances my comprehension. A lot of these co-writers will just start out with like, what are you writing about today? And I'll just like ask you a question. So it starts with a title, and then based on the title, it will just start suggestions and be like, okay, so subtitles, traditionally designed to aid individuals with hearing impairments, hold significant promise. So it just kind of tries to generate something. And the thing is, it will back up every claim with a research paper, right? So pretty much you just hit the forward button, it will just kind of auto-complete the papers, and you just keep hitting the forward button, and it will just like do its best to just generate whatever it can for you. And as you can see here, I've set it to APA, but you can do different styles, and you can do the output in different styles. So similar to what Zotero does. And you can always say, try again. So if you didn't like the output, so you can retry. and then you can do it again. The thing is, it gets like it gets super repetitive after a while. So it'll be like a circle. It'll just like keep talking about the same stuff with the same references. So this is like where I'm saying, like, don't check out your brain and just like hit next, because it'll just lead like to the most boring thing you've ever done. Now the problem with it is, of course, again, like all of these references are not pre-filtered, right? Like you don't know how good they are. You don't know like how useful a lot of them are. And again, a lot of them are missed because if it's not in Semantic Scholar, it will not show up here. So it might miss the most important work in your field, which is not something you would do. But does it help you fill in the blanks? So let's assume we're in the stage where we've like pre-written the draft with the things that we actually want to mention, and now we're doing the padding. It's sort of a thin line, I would say, because a lot of the time the way that the text is written will sound overly stiff, so you probably have to rewrite it, just kind of based on the output. It's just a very stiff form of writing. But it does, it does kind of help you jump over those stare in the blank moments. This is one of the things that I really like here. So pretty much you can create a custom library, so you can put your own PDFs in there. You can query your PDFs, so you can put extra references in here. So then you could just go into the document AI, and here then you could actually say, okay, this was nice, but maybe I need to rewrite the introduction. Again, a lot of these things are just gonna get you out of blank page mode if you're just not sure where to start, or you're kind of in between the things. It'll just give you some suggestions. It's not a matter of like, okay, this is done now, I'm gonna pass this off and this is gonna be my paper. Although I can guarantee you that there's at least 10, 15 papers at this year's CHI that were written exactly in this way. And I don't think there was a lot of human touch at the end, but they just got submitted like that and they managed to get in. So kudos to them. But you'll actually easily find those because you'll just go through the reference list. And if you find that all of the references, this would be a task for a future systematic review. If you can find the CHI papers and you go through the reference list and you find that all of the references in the reference list are exclusively from Semantic Scholar, you know something fishy is going on, right? So this is a way that it's difficult though, because you literally have to do a reverse search on every reference, and who got time for that? So the way that Sourcely works is essentially it takes a statement and then it generates a backup for that statement. So here you could just now look at this statement, you could hit the cite button, and now it will go through this. It's a semantic search again that's happening here. It will go through the statement that you've done, and then it will find the 10 best references for that, which is, again, super cool. If you're like, how often have you written something, you're kind of wondering, okay, so I need to find a reference to back that up with. So what we used to do back in the day, we used to go to Google Scholar and be like, hey, how can I back up this claim that I've just made with a reference? And so here's a quick way to quickly back that up, because here you can just click through it. You can view the source right away, and it'll just get you that reference. So just a quicker way to do something that Google Scholar used to do for us, based on semantic search instead of like having to go through a complete Google Scholar search. But litmaps, yeah, so here we copy the DOI, digital object identifier for those uninitiated, and then we can toss that into litmaps, and then I can select an article, and then I can just hit explore the related articles, and then it will generate this literature map based on that article. It just takes a little bit. So then it'll essentially, and then you can just adjust. So as you can see here, this is like more citations, more recently published. So like the higher it is, the more citations it has, and the more to the right it is, the more recent the article is. So you can easily identify which articles have a lot of citations and which articles were sort of the more original articles. This sometimes is good when you want to cite the original article research and not the article that has just cited the original research, but you want to go back one thing. So it's easy to then just go back in the lit map and actually find the one that has happened before, and then just see whatever other articles have been cited from this one. And you can add, if you have them, you can add them manually to the lit map. And that way you can expand your map over time and just get a little bit of better results. Consensus, you can just run a query, like what's the performance of 2D ResNet 50? You can just run a query asking about a specific question, and what it will then do, and this is kind of nice, it will give you an overview of the literature and whether or not there's a consensus about the research question that you've just asked. And it will also give you a way to phrase your question as a yes or no question, which is not a research question, but it's an easy way to actually get insights or a consensus of a thing, like are video games addictive or something like that, right? Like, and it'll give you actually a consensus of the literature, as in like this many articles are pro, this many articles are against, and this many articles are giving you other things like that. It should be good enough that it pulls up the consensus meter. So here it says a minority of gamers, negative outcome, effects and predictors, and so forth. And then it has all of the surveys, and it has these indicators for each of the things that it gives you. So here it's unknown, as in like this thing. So this is actually interesting because here is like the actual question, and it actually says this is a no answer. And this is clearly a good one because this is a systematic review. And then here it will say observational study, rigorous journal. So it gives you like these nice little indicators of like how good, how trustworthy are each of these things. And then it will say this is more in the no camp, this is in the yes camp, and so forth. And then you can always load more results. And as you load more results, the consensus meter will also shift and change. There's several different options that you can do for AI diagramming. The one thing that a lot of people are doing now is DALL-E, right? Like, you know, with the most recent update of DALL-E, it actually got really good that you can now prompt infographics and you can prompt flowcharts. So if you prompt for that, you'll get it. But I'll show you in the next slide like how weird that can be. Because it's super error prone and it will often require a lot of reprompting to actually do the thing that you want it to do. Like, it will look good on the first look, but once you look at like what's actually being connected, it'll be a little bit weird. Another way to do it, and this is usually my preferred way, is generate SVG code. So you actually actively prompt it to output an SVG file, and this is actually best done O3 mini high. Which is actually pretty good for code, or in Claude 3.7 Sonnet, which is also really great at generating code. And then you still have to, like, it still will be messy. You still have to clean up that SVG file, which I will do. I would recommend Affinity Designer 2 because you can get a free Canva education license with your university email account. And with that, you can download Affinity Designer 2, which is a vector program that allows you to clean up these files really quickly. The second way to do it is to generate mermaid syntax and convert this into a flowchart with free tools. Gemini 2.5 Pro is best for that, and I'll show you in the next thing how that looks like. The free tools are draw.io and xcalidraw, so you can Google those. They will allow you to import mermaid syntax into them, and they will then create a mermaid syntax diagram. The last one to do is to generate TIX syntax. So those of you familiar with LaTeX know that TIX is a way to generate flowcharts in LaTeX, and it will actually look really nice. And then you insert that in an overleaf LaTeX file. This is a separate file, or it can be directly in the LaTeX code. And Claude 3.5 Sonnet is actually best at TIX. None of the other AIs do really good TIX code currently. But it's still, with all of these, there's a bit of cleanup required. The results are usually not perfect. And just to show you kind of how good this is what I did to prove it. So this is not even rotated correctly, right? Like, this is just shot with my phone. I just drew a little flow chart. And all I wanted to do here is to understand that this is a cycle, and then experiment is, like, this is even nonsensical. I think this is actually my problem, because like, this is even not a very sensical sequence of things. And I think some of the AIs are too smart, as in like they don't understand what the sequence here is, because this sequence actually doesn't make sense if you think about it. So they will be like, what are you trying to do here? So I fed it to Claude 3.5 Sonnet. This is what happened. It just like, and the prompt is up here. Zero-shot prompt, generate a flowchart and mermaid syntax from the attached photo. And so this is the output in xcalidraw. So then I got this output, idea, validate, design, experiment, results. So clearly that's not right, because experiment branches into validate and goes back into the cycle, and result is a separate branch, right? So incorrect, Claude 3.5, which is weird, because Claude 3.5 Sonnet is usually good at programming stuff. Then ChatGPT O4 Mini High actually understood it. It's like idea, design, experiment, validate. This is a cycle, so it got the cycle right, and it saw that the result needs to split. Okay, so far ChatGPT O4 Mini passes the thing. It has understood the correct sequence of the prompt that I wanted. Gemini 2.5 Pro experimental is the best output, because it even colored it for me, and it's like, okay, results a little bit different, so I'm going to give it a different color as well. So it already understands the semantics of what's going on here. So Gemini 2.5 Pro, definitely the best version. And then just for funsies, I put it into Grok, because, you know, let's see what Elon does. And a mess, right? Like, it's like, okay, there's a cycle, but just put validate in here. I think maybe it is too smart, because it's like, you should validate your results, and validate really doesn't make sense before that. Whatever happened, it's not what I wanted. It's not based on the image, not correct, right? So what I can recommend if you want to generate mermaid syntax is to either do it with ChatGPT O4 Mini High or 2.5 Pro. If you want more, email me at this address. If you like this course, I would really appreciate a testimonial. There'll be a goodie in that for you as well, that I'll send you if you fill that out. And if you want to find me on social, you can find me on LinkedIn, on Elon's thing, on Blue Sky, on Threads, on TikTok, on Instagram, on YouTube, on Medium, on all the things. Just Google for me, and I'd love to see you there.